Hey there. If you're new, welcome to the channel. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Let me know in the comments. Now, sit back, relax, and let the stories begin. At the time this happened, I was deep in the grip of addiction and battling severe depression. A few years earlier, I was on track to start a family and build a successful business. Then, as if fate slapped me across the face, my fiancée, who was 3 months pregnant, suffered a miscarriage and lost our first child. Naturally, I was devastated, but she was completely shattered. It didn't take long before she told me our marriage was over and that she was leaving. I could have fought for her, but to be honest, I had lost all desire to keep the relationship going myself. Although I had been somewhat of a partygoer before, I dove headfirst into alcohol and drugs after that. It wasn't about having a good time. I didn't even care about living anymore, but I was too scared to take my own life. I found myself living in a rundown area of town in an apartment complex known for crime. It was easy to get drugs there, but had I been in a better place in life, I would never have come close to this neighborhood. Most of the residents kept to themselves and minded their own business, but a new neighbor moved in above me, and he was a real pain. This guy played his music full blast every day from 6 a.m. to well past midnight. At first, I thought earplugs might help, but the bass was so loud it rattled through the bed. I did my best to ignore it, but things got worse when New Year's rolled around. On that night, the stereo wasn't the issue, it was his guests. When the sun set, they started setting off fireworks and smashing beer bottles right outside my apartment. I put up with it for as long as I could, but by 1 a.m., the noise was still going strong. I had finally reached my breaking point and went upstairs to speak with him. It took a little while to get him to answer the door, but when he did, I was met with immediate hostility. All I asked was that he tell his guests to stop the fireworks and bottle smashing, especially right in front of my place. I was polite, but you'd have thought I insulted his family by his reaction. He started cursing at me, telling me to mind my own business. That's when I stopped being nice and fired back with my own curse words. Within moments, he lunged at me, and I instinctively grabbed his throat in defense. One of his friends stepped in to break us apart, but during the struggle, my neighbor pulled out a gun and started firing at me. This caused his friend to push him even harder, breaking us apart. It took me a moment to realize he was actually shooting, but when I did, I ran down the stairs and bolted into my apartment. It wasn't until I locked the door behind me that I realized I had been hit. One shot had hit me just under my right breast and another had grazed my right arm. I stumbled to my kitchen and grabbed my phone to dial 911. Talking to the dispatcher was difficult because it had become very hard to breathe. The more blood I lost, the weaker I became until I collapsed on the floor. I dropped the phone when I did, but didn't have the energy to pick it back up. As I laid there fighting for every breath, I realized I didn't really want to die. The fear I was feeling was a wake-up call. I vowed to God that if he let me live, I was going to make up for every minute I'd wasted feeling sorry for myself. The cops had to knock down the door to get to me. That's about all I remember for the remainder of that night. I discovered later that night my neighbor had fled after the shooting, but the cops had caught up with him a couple of blocks away. Didi tried to shoot it out with them and actually lost his life because of it. It's the best result as far as I'm concerned. I didn't have a trial to worry about, and he didn't get to suck off the taxpayers for the next 50 years. I lost consciousness soon after the paramedics started working on me and wouldn't wake up for several hours after that. The grazed of my arm was no big deal. However, the shot to my chest had collapsed my lung and almost caused me to bleed to death. It took the surgeons over an hour to stop all the bleeding, and even then I was still in critical condition for a few days. I was finally moved to a regular room on 5th and stayed there for 4 more days before I was released. The healing process was long and painful. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to have parents that hadn't yet given up on me, and I stayed with them during my recovery. Once my body was well on the way to healing, I had to work on my soul. I began going to NA and AA meetings as often as possible and worked hard to get past all the roadblocks that I had put in front of me. After a year or so of sobriety, I began helping others on a volunteer basis at first, but eventually I began working at an inpatient rehab facility. During this journey, I met a very wonderful lady. She's a nurse, and we currently are in the process of planning our wedding that should take place this June. Although I still have a long road ahead of me if I want to become a better man, I thank God every day for giving me the chance to be here, and I promise myself, him, and everyone that I will continue to work my hardest to fulfill the vow I made to him that night. This took place last January. I had taken the week off after New Year's, hoping that by then, everyone would be back at work, and I could enjoy some peace and quiet without the usual crowds. My plan was to spend the week shopping and relaxing in my apartment, mostly by myself. On this particular day, I spent most of my time driving around in the snow and hitting a few stores, eventually making my way back to the apartment around 7 p.m. Once inside, I took a moment to warm up before grabbing some snacks and sitting down on the couch. I started watching TV, and with the exhaustion from being out all day, I found myself dozing off a little. But around 8:30, the PA system in my building buzzed, signaling someone was outside and wanted in. Since I wasn't expecting anyone, I had no idea who it could be. The buzzer went off again, so I got up and went to the window that faced the front of the building. I only lifted the blinds slightly, just enough to see who it was. At the door stood a tall man. It was still snowy, and the lighting was dim, but I could make out that he was probably in his mid-40s. I didn't recognize him. There were only 3 other people living in the complex, so I knew everyone here, and he wasn't one of them. I figured if he was a visitor, one of the others would have let him in. I muted the PA system, went back to the couch, and continued watching TV. I didn't think much more of it and even dozed off a few more times over the next hour. Eventually, I turned off the TV and headed to bed. By then, it must have been close to 10. I fell asleep almost immediately. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from just outside my room. It was incredibly loud, but since I had just woken up, I couldn't tell exactly where it came from. My heart raced as I stared at the door, listening intently. The house was eerily quiet now, as if nothing had happened. I got out of bed, moving cautiously toward the door, and pressed my ear against it to listen. Still nothing. It was as silent as ever, except for the usual creaks from the building. I turned the handle, stepped into the living room, and saw nothing out of place. It was very dark, and for some reason, I felt the need to remain quiet, almost as if I shouldn't make myself known. So, I kept the lights off as I quietly moved through the living room and into the hallway. That's when I saw it. The door to my apartment was wide open. I froze up, staring at the open doorway and feeling fear run through my whole body. It almost didn't seem real. I took a few steps back, staying quiet, and made my way back toward my room. And now, on the other side of the door, I could see a huge dent in the wood right by the knob. Once I saw that, I ran in and locked it behind me, then called 911 while hiding in the closet. I was sure that whoever it was had to be somewhere inside my apartment still, and it would only be a matter of time before they get into my room. But as I waited for the police, the apartment stayed silent. Whoever had broken into my apartment was gone. Even the police couldn't find anything to help in finding them. What they think happened is the intruder tried buzzing all the other rooms as well, until one of them was nice enough to let them in. Once he was in the main stairwell, it's not really clear why he chose to go for my room. Maybe they thought it was empty. What's really strange is the dent on my bedroom door, which was likely the source of the thud that I'd woken up to, but it was just one single hit, not looking like a real attempt at breaking the door down, but more like something out of frustration before he left. I still live in the same apartment and nothing else has happened. Who it was and what they wanted is unknown. This story is from about 32 years ago, back in East Texas. When I was 16, my parents divorced, and my brothers and I stayed with my mom. My dad didn't visit regularly, mostly showing up when he had money from gambling, which, ironically, was one of the reasons my parents split up in the first place. When he did win big, though, he would visit, spoil us, and then vanish again. He told us he worked as a shuttle driver for a local hotel, but he also claimed that the shuttle job was just a cover for his real work with organized crime, which supposedly owned the hotel. He said his actual job was to pick up fugitives from around the area, people with warrants or those on the run, and bring them to the hotel to hide out. After that, he said they'd be moved, but he never knew how. We didn't take him seriously. He was always exaggerating and lying. But something happened that changed everything. My dad disappeared. It was 1988. I was 22, still in college, and working full-time as a DJ at a local radio station, doing the overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. My middle brother, 19, lived with a friend in an apartment and worked at a nearby Dairy Queen. My youngest brother, 9, still lived at home. One day, my middle brother called both my mom and me, asking if we knew where our dad was. Apparently, a couple of men had shown up at his job and asked if he'd seen our dad recently. My brother told them the truth, that he hadn't seen or heard from him in months, and that our dad often cut off contact for long periods. The men didn't identify themselves but seemed satisfied with his answer and left. My brother asked if anyone else had called us asking about our dad, but we hadn't heard from him either. The next day, those same men showed up at my brother's work again, this time flashing badges and claiming to be FBI agents. They were aggressive and demanded to know where our dad was. My brother, visibly shaken, kept insisting he didn't know, and that the last he'd heard, our dad was working as a shuttle driver at a local hotel. Disturbed by the encounter, my brother called us again, and my mom, in a panic, called the hotel where our dad worked. The man she spoke to confirmed that our dad had disappeared weeks ago and that no one knew where he was. The following day, my brother's roommate called to say that someone had apparently been in their apartment. When the roommate returned from work, he found the sliding glass door open and the apartment ransacked. Strangely, nothing seemed to be missing. My brother went to check and found that his address book, a teddy bear he had bought for his son, and a photo of his son were all gone. Upset and scared, my brother, my mom, and I decided to go to the local FBI office to report the harassment and tell them, once and for all, that my brother didn't know where our dad was. But when we got there, the FBI denied knowing anything about the situation. They insisted they weren't looking for my dad and that no agents had contacted my brother. When my mom mentioned that our dad had claimed to work for organized crime, the FBI refused to confirm or deny any connection between the hotel and organized crime, or whether there was an investigation underway. My mom called the hotel again, telling the manager about the men looking for our dad and harassing my brother. She flat out asked him if there was any truth to my dad's claim about working for the mafia. The manager laughed and said, "Lady, there's no such thing as the mafia. As we were trying to make sense of everything, we couldn't figure out why my brother was being harassed while neither my mom nor I was being contacted." Then, I remembered something strange that had happened to me about 2 or 3 weeks before all this started. Since I worked the overnight shift, I often found myself wide awake in the middle of the night on my days off, with nothing to do. One night, I decided to visit my friend who worked as a computer system operator at the local cable TV company. I was just going to hang out with him and pass some time. Around 3:30 in the morning, he had a big job to do, so it was time for me to head home. But as soon as I pulled out of his company's driveway, a car came up right behind me, tailgating me closely. It happened so fast that it startled me. The car seemed to appear out of nowhere, and the driver had their high beams on, blinding me completely. I couldn't make out any details about the car, couldn't tell what kind it was, how many people were inside, or even what they looked like. It was just a dark silhouette. So, I changed lanes, hoping the driver would pass, but he followed me and changed lanes with me. I tried again, but the car stayed right behind me, tailgating and blinding me, now clearly following me. At the next intersection, I got into the left turning lane and signaled, but the car stayed right behind me. Since there was no other traffic, I decided to try to lose him. When the light changed, I sped across the intersection, darted through all the lanes to the far right, and went through the intersection, hoping to shake him off. But he kept following. Now it was obvious that he was definitely trailing me. I quickly cut into a nearby neighborhood, trying to lose him, but he kept right behind me. Finally, I made my way back to the main intersection, drove to a 7-Eleven nearby, jumped out of my car, and ran inside, telling the clerk that someone was following me. As I said this, I saw the same car pull through the 7-Eleven parking lot, and for the first time, I got a good look at it. It was a tan-colored late-model 4-door car with 2 white guys in it. The clerk just dismissed me, saying I was probably exaggerating and that it was just kids messing around. He told me to let it go. I was shaken up, but didn't want to go straight home because I was worried the car might follow me. I didn't want them to know where I lived, so I decided to go back to work instead. I knew my friend Paula would be the DJ on air, so I went to visit her to calm down. I told Paula everything that had happened, and she agreed it was probably just some jerks messing with me, which helped calm me down a little. But when I finally went home, more than 2 hours after the whole ordeal, I saw that same car parked outside my apartment. As I was about to turn onto my street, the car pulled out of the parking lot, and as it passed me, they flashed their high beams at me again. There was no mistaking it. It was the same car. I panicked and immediately called Paula at the radio station. She was just as freaked out as I was, asking, "Why would they be waiting for you at your home? Who are these people? Call the police right now." Couldn't believe it. How did they know where I lived? Why had they waited for 2 hours and then, when they finally saw me, just flashed their lights and drove off? The whole thing didn't make sense, but as I thought about it, connecting the dots with my brother's run-in with the FBI and the break-in at his apartment, it started to seem pretty clear. Everything was tied together. I hadn't thought about it before, but now it hit me. The car I was driving was actually my dad's. He had given it to me a couple of months earlier when he got a new one. So if these people were looking for my dad, they might have mistaken me for him. When they saw me coming home, they must have realized I wasn't him, and that's when they just drove off. But that still left a lot of questions. Who was messing with us and why? Where was my dad? Why were these strange people harassing us? My mom, my brother, and I went to the local police station to file a missing persons report and a formal complaint. We spoke with a very kind detective, and about 5 days later, he called us back, claiming he had solved the whole bizarre situation. It turned out that my dad had disappeared because he owed more than $50,000 in gambling debts. The detective confirmed that my dad had indeed worked for some shady characters, as he put it, but said they weren't exactly organized crime. He wasn't sure if my dad had been involved in shuttling fugitives, but he said my dad was hiding out somewhere in Nevada. The detective had spoken to him, and my dad was alive and well, but in hiding. We asked the detective, then, who those men were and why they had been harassing my brother. He explained that it wasn't uncommon for bounty hunters and debt collectors from the underworld to impersonate law enforcement and sometimes call or even harass people to get information. My brother asked how they had gotten into his apartment. The detective explained that sliding glass doors are easy to open, and they probably took the address book hoping to find my dad's contact info. The teddy bear and the pictures were likely stolen to scare my brother, something they clearly succeeded in doing. I asked why they only harassed my brother and not my mom or me. The detective told us that my dad had used my brother as a reference on his job application at the hotel and had listed my brother's address and phone number. The fake FBI agents must have assumed that my brother was close to my dad and might have stayed in contact with him or, if threatened, would eventually reach out. In the end, my dad eventually came back to town and acted as if nothing had ever happened. He never mentioned the incident, and we never brought it up. I'm assuming he managed to pay back the money he owed, but honestly, I'll never know for sure. Anyway, that's my story, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I work in food service, front of house. When the pandemic first hit and restaurants were closed, I took on any job I could find. An old friend told me about a medical office that needed help with some light filing, and I was able to go in at night to limit contact with others. It was honestly the safest gig I had been offered at that point. I decided to skip the bus to avoid the crowds, so I used a rideshare app instead. It wasn't too expensive in my area, and I really didn't want to risk getting the virus. I headed out around 3 a.m. after the cleaning crew had left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious, though, because I was exhausted, I wandered around the block searching for my ride, and to my relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up, asking, "Uber." I hadn't realized it was taking a while, but I had just moved here the year before, so I wasn't too familiar with the area and thought nothing of it. At first, I stayed pretty alert, trying to pass the time by playing games on my phone. However, the car didn't have a charger that worked with my phone, and I wasn't sure if the building would have one either. I decided to put my phone in airplane mode to save the battery in case I needed it to call a ride back. Eventually, I drifted off due to a combination of exhaustion and boredom. I don't usually take rideshare, so being alone with a stranger always makes me a little uneasy. But this guy seemed pretty normal. He had a clean-cut look and was listening to jazz, which made him seem more like a standard driver. There was nothing about him that screamed, "You need to micromanage this trip." When we arrived, he tried waking me by calling out to me from the front. But I was so deep in sleep, I couldn't tell the difference between his voice and my dream. Eventually, he gently shook my leg to wake me up, repeatedly calling, "Ma'am, ma'am, we're here now." I was embarrassed that I'd been that out of it, so I hurriedly said, "Thanks," and rushed out of the car into the building. As I looked around, I started to realize that nothing was what I had expected. When I first looked up the business, the street view had shown it to be a strip mall plaza, but now the place seemed completely different. The building looked semi-dilapidated, and the whole place was pitch black past the entryway. I figured some lights would be off, but not the entire building. I hurried through the lobby area, telling myself that they must be renovating, and followed the signs for the stairs. After what felt like forever, but was probably just a few minutes, all I saw were construction materials, a few locked doors, and some broken windows. I began to realize I was definitely not going to find a medical office, and I started wondering if maybe I had mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my texts that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I would try to get in touch with the driver because if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling a second trip, considering this was all his mix-up. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one I had taken up, so it would force me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker, especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something so jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help get me from the property because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night and didn't have enough reception to call a new ride. But the message wasn't sending. Reception was too weak. So I gave up on getting my phone going and started checking for another stairwell, or even a window with a balcony or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort, in the event whoever was downstairs came upstairs. I scrambled over to a door with a stairs sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst-case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured based on my walk the floor was basically a giant loop, so I would have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs. Wait for them to come all the way up and then sprint the opposite direction of wherever they were going and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might have been living there feel as though I had trespassed and become hostile towards me, or have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to just 30 seconds, and the person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, it was just the Uber driver. I figured he had come back for me, realizing he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. So I came out from the beam I was hidden behind and started to wave him down. But then I processed. There was no way for him to realize this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly, and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he might have returned. But in that moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes. Operating solely on muscle memory and instinct, I Superman dove from the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think he had seen where I had gone at first. And though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised, but nothing was completely broken. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door. It was too dark to tell. I was disoriented from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, there's another one of these guys. And I stumbled backwards, trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could, a voice called out, "All right, this is the police department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such a fight or flight mode and had already committed to flight that I continued looking for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around, and he yelled, "Hey," I said, "get on the ground right now. Hands out. Hands out where I can see them." He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did exactly as he asked. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. Took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see he was really a police officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions, and that, combined with what had just happened and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into my being unable to perform a single articulate sentence. He was even asking easy questions too, like, "Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke or cut me? Would you rather talk in here or outside?" And my total stunned babbling in response at first led him to believe that I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked the same questions again. The first thing I could think to ask was, "Did my friends call you? What did they tell you?" And he explained, no, nobody called him. He was just patrolling the area when he noticed a car idling outside a building that was known to be condemned, and no one was supposed to be inside. He told me that when people are in there, they're usually up to no good. He started giving me a speech about how if I had gone to shoot up or meet a client, he had resources he could direct me to, but this wasn't an ideal spot for either of those things. He even asked if I had somewhere safe to stay that night, but something he had said earlier stuck with me. Then it clicked. The car. I spilled the whole rideshare story in a frantic mess of words. The officer looked around, but the car wasn't there anymore. He guessed that the driver had taken off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me to recount all the details I could remember, but there wasn't much to tell. I'd been so tired when the ride started that I didn't track much. But then the officer had an idea. He said I could pull up my Uber app and get all the info. There wasn't much reception in the area, not even outdoors, so we quickly sped down the road until I had enough bars for the app to work. When it finally loaded, I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. They said, "Hello, I've arrived. I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct?" I'm flashing my hazards. And finally, "Unfortunately, your driver had to cancel." At first, I thought the driver was so clever that he'd picked me up while sending fake messages, canceling the ride so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing I wouldn't notice because I had been asleep with my phone off, leaving him off the hook. But when I checked the car details, it was clear. It wasn't the same driver. The person who had driven me there wasn't my Uber. My actual driver had been somewhere else on the street when the guy pulled up to me. The officer took my statement and said they'd keep an eye out for him, but all I could give them was a basic description. A young-looking man with brown hair, sideburns, a goatee, driving a 4-door sedan, wearing a zip-up sweatshirt, maybe with a hood. That description could fit a ton of people in the city. I feel so lucky to have escaped that situation. Needless to say, I no longer use rideshare services. Always quadruple check your license plate and driver's name. You just never know. I've had 4 separate encounters with deadly venomous snakes, and it's almost as if I was tracking them down or something. The first time was when I was just a little girl. I lived on a farm and had been sent out to collect eggs for breakfast. I grabbed my egg basket and made my way to the chicken coop. What I didn't realize at the time was that there was a deadly predator hiding in the coop I was about to enter. I picked up the first hen, gathered her eggs, gave her a pat on the head, and moved to the next nesting box. As I stepped up to the next hen, it felt like someone had hit me hard in the back of the leg with a baseball bat. I screamed, spun around, and that's when I saw the snake slithering away. My granddad rushed over to see what was wrong. I told him about the snake and that it had bitten me. He grabbed a shovel and dealt with it. Turns out it was a large and angry western diamondback rattlesnake. I spent weeks in the hospital, nearly dying a couple of times, but here I am today. Several years later, when I was around 9 or 10, I had another close encounter. I was sitting in a fishing boat with my uncle and brother, trying to catch something for a fish fry. We were out on a big pond on a friend of my uncle's property, packed with fish. I wasn't particularly thrilled to be in the boat with my brother, so I was feeling a bit sulky. I brought along my portable Walkman to drown out the boys, settled down at the bottom of the boat, and tried to relax while I waited for the whole thing to be over. I was lost in my music when, suddenly, I heard my uncle screaming at me. I turned down the music, looked up, and saw my uncle's face contorted in pure, unadulterated horror. I froze, terrified, having no idea what was going on. That's when I felt something brush against my hair, just a tiny flicker, but I still didn't move. My uncle grabbed a weapon and a boat, pointing his weapon over my left shoulder. I turned just enough to see a black snake's head crawling up the boat, right next to me. I completely lost it. I screamed and jumped just as my uncle fired. It turned out to be a water moccasin, also known as a cottonmouth. Years later, as a teenager, I was working with my father and his friend, laying carpet in old rundown trailers for some extra cash. It was summertime and the heat was brutal. We were working on this particularly filthy old trailer, trying to make it livable again, though I couldn't really see the point, but I went along with it. My dad's friend handed me the tools and carpet, telling me to go into one of the bedroom closets, which would eventually be the kids' room. The closet was large and walk-in, but it was so dark that I had trouble seeing anything at all. So I go in this closet and go to the far corner and start working on pulling this nasty old carpet out. So I'm pulling and yanking and cussing when I hear a sound that sends shivers down my spine. It's the sound of a rattlesnake. I didn't try to move because I wasn't sure where he was. It was dark and I wasn't trying to get bit again. So I go screaming for my dad, which he's a lot of help because he's terrified of snakes too. He walks into the room, hears that sound and runs out. Luckily, my dad's friend wasn't quite so afraid. He walked outside and got a bucket, used a stick to pick up the snake, and got it back outside where it belonged. Now here's my last snake experience. I'm dating this guy who has a wood-burning fireplace in his house. So one morning we are out on a friend's property cutting some wood for firewood. Yes, I have been out there with them cutting these trees. We had been out in the woods since the sun came up working our butts off. It was around lunchtime and I was about done for the day. So I grabbed my drink and scouted the nicest place to sit and take a break for a bit. There was a nice little break in the trees and turned into a nice rocky area with some rather nice and large rocks for me to sit down on. The sun was shining. It was starting to warm up. Just an all-around beautiful Ozarks day. So I pick out the flattest rock I could find to rest on. So I sit down to take my rest. I'm sitting on this rock for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, just taking it easy, enjoying the day. And the guy I was with walks up to me, looks down, and then jumps back away from me like 3 or 4 feet. I looked at him like he was nuts. He said, "Enjoying yourself?" And I said, "Yes, I am. It's a beautiful day." He looks at me and says, "You do realize that you are sitting right beside the biggest copperhead snake I've ever seen, right?" My whole body went cold. I started to sweat. If I move, he's gonna bite me. I know it. I look down ever so slowly, and this snake is literally snuggled up next to my right thigh. I have no clue what I'm going to do. I can't move. And this very large, very venomous snake is content to just sit right here and snuggle with me all day in the sun. I am dying inside at this moment. This stupid situation couldn't get any worse, except it could. I drank my whole bottle of water, and now I have to go to the bathroom. I'm not going to be able to sit here all day, and I'm freaking out. So my boyfriend and his buddy decide to try and distract the snake so I could make a mad dash away. They tried sticks. They tried rocks. Anything and everything they could. My situation was getting on the urgent level with my bladder, so I told my boyfriend to go and get my jacket out of his truck. I was going to have to do this myself, apparently. When he came back with my jacket, I told him my plan. He's going to drop the jacket on top of the snake, and as soon as he did, I'm going to bolt. Timing had to be precise. As soon as that jacket got within an inch or two of touching that snake, I jumped sideways off that rock and rolled away as far and as fast as I could. And no, I never got my jacket back either. That snuggly snake could have it. So now you've heard my stories. If I ever die suddenly, at least you folks will know how and why. This took place when I was 14, and despite my poor memory, it's something I'll never forget. I have a feeling this memory will stay with me forever. I frequently went walking alone or with my neighbor, Jim, but this particular night, she didn't join me. Typically, I'd head out around 9 p.m., but that evening, I was impatient and left about 15 minutes earlier than usual. It was summer in Texas, yet I still grabbed my black hoodie. The reason was simple. I was small for my age, and I carried a knife in my sleeve just in case something went wrong. The area did have security, but they weren't much help and didn't exactly like the kids hanging around. I wore the hoodie to stay under the radar, hoping it would help me avoid notice. The neighborhood was full of dense woods, and there were no streetlights on the roads. Having lived there all my life, I wasn't concerned. The moonlight provided all the light I needed. I made my way to the local park and settled on the swing set, a familiar spot. The park was old and neglected. The swing set creaked under my weight. The wooden picnic tables were rotting with most of the paint chipped away, and the metal slide was rusty. The main road ran in front of the park, with a side road that ran beside it, separated by a narrow stretch of trees. After a while, one of my favorite songs came on, and I started singing along. Despite my stage fright, singing was a way for me to release stress, especially in this quiet, deserted park where I could let go without anyone hearing me. Then, a chill ran down my spine as I spotted a figure standing about 50 to 100 feet ahead of me on the main road. The fear that they might have heard me sing was what first sent a shiver through me, but then something felt off about them. The person was moving unnaturally fast, almost like they were sprinting. I thought they might be running from something or chasing something, but as I scanned my surroundings, I saw nothing else. They walked past the park without noticing me, and after a few minutes of making sure they were gone, I resumed singing. A couple of songs later, I decided it was time to head home, but that bad feeling stayed with me. My stomach twisted in that familiar, uncomfortable way you get when you feel like someone's watching you. I could have sworn I saw something move behind the trees between the side road and the swings, but I dismissed it as just an animal, maybe a deer or a dog. There were plenty of animals around. It was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. Still, the unease lingered, so I cut my usual 30-minute to an hour walk down to just 10 minutes. So I got up and started to leave the park, turning onto the main road to go home. As I was leaving, I saw a person walking toward the main road from the road that ran alongside the park. It looked like the same person as before. It was a man. He must have been visiting a friend or something, right? Even if that was the case, I crossed to the opposite side of the street so I wouldn't pass directly by him. He didn't look particularly dangerous or unusual, so sadly no weird, creepy, homeless-looking man for this story. I just got a bad feeling from him, which is probably what makes him even more terrifying. He got to the intersection before me and stopped. I passed by and glanced at the man, taking in what details I could under the moonlight that came from between the tree branches. He looked normal. He was probably an average height, wearing a pure white ball cap with no logos that casted a shadow over his face and a pure white polo-type shirt. There wasn't a speck of dirt on the man. He looked well kept, and it made the moonlight almost shine on him like some kind of ghost, which just added to my uneasy feeling. He watched me as I passed by, and I tried to pretend that I didn't notice. I would occasionally look around as if I was just looking at the woods so I could see the man out of my peripheral vision. I didn't want or need to see the man in detail, partly because I was scared of the possibility of seeing something else too. Just because the man was much larger than me didn't mean that he wasn't probably armed too. Once I was around 15 feet past the intersection, I glanced and my stomach dropped as I saw him turn and start to follow me. Maybe he was just going for an extra long walk or something. He probably isn't following me, right? Then another thought popped in my head and sent my stomach to my feet. I had been there for probably 10 minutes or so singing after he passed. What if he wasn't visiting anyone? What if he was the thing I saw just beyond the tree line? That's kinda obvious now that this was almost definitely the case. But let's be fair, when do 14-year-olds ever think through all the details of a situation completely during the situation? He was probably watching me the whole time. He could have snuck up and done God knows what at any time. I kept doing my glances and noticed that he was getting closer and closer. I gripped my knife tighter, ready in case I had to use it. The chance of it going well wasn't the best, but it was a better chance than not trying at all. But I wanted that to be a last-ditch option. I tried to make sure it wasn't obvious I was keeping tabs on him. I didn't want him getting anxious and having to decide to speed up or whatever his plan was. I was only halfway home, and this was before I had surgery on my ankle, so I was absolutely sure he could catch me before I reached the house if I started running where I was. So that wasn't an option whatsoever. I didn't have many current options, so the one I chose was to bide my time until an opportunity opened up. I kept walking at a rather quick but unpanicked pace, keeping tabs on the man as he inched closer and kept an eye out for opportunities. And an opportunity came. I saw headlights. A car was rolling towards me at a careful pace, like normal considering the animals I mentioned earlier. It was Jim's dad. I recognized the shape of the lights, and as the car got closer, I became convinced it was him. I was never so relieved to see that tiny white car. I tried signaling him without letting the man know I was, but he just passed by. He must have thought I was just saying hi. I glanced back again. Even though he didn't stop, he did exactly what I needed. He slowed down a bit as he passed. The man backed up a lot and crossed to the other side of the road. The headlights were on him and he couldn't see me at least for around 5 or 6 seconds. Maybe a bit longer, including readjusting to the dark. I walked faster. I didn't run, that way my steps wouldn't be too loud, but I rounded the corner before he would be able to readjust and get sight of me again. Once I could turn and no longer see him, I rushed home and locked the door. I knew better than to leave it unlocked since, after all, I lived in the woods. Just because I couldn't see him anymore didn't mean he wasn't nearby and didn't mean he couldn't see me. As stupid as this next part is, it's probably for the best that I did it. I texted Jim. I asked her to meet me outside right now because something happened and I needed to come over. She said okay, and we both went outside, and as soon as I saw her in the driveway, I sprinted to her house. I didn't want to be outside any longer than I had to be. She kept panicking and asking what happened and what was wrong, and once I caught my breath, I told her everything. Right after I got done explaining, her dad walked in the house. He looked at Jim, seeming worried, then noticed me hiding behind her. He let out a sigh of relief and said, "I was just about to tell you to ask her to come over here." I asked him if he had seen the man following me, and he confirmed that he had. He couldn't make out his face clearly, but he noticed the guy was pretending to talk on the phone, even though he wasn't holding anything. But that wasn't even the scariest part. It was the first time I had ever seen him scared, and I don't think I've ever seen him that terrified since. He told us the man wasn't alone. There was a gate at the entrance to where I lived that required a card to open. Apparently, another man who looked just like the first was standing by a van outside the gate. That meant they didn't live there, didn't want security to notice them, and planned to leave quickly and quietly after whatever they were doing. I ended up staying at Jim's that night. I still wonder what would have happened if Jim's dad hadn't driven by or if I had left at my usual time. I was 19 at the time of this story, and I had just started a new job at a Greek restaurant in my town. To make matters more complicated, I had just found out I was 6 weeks pregnant, though I was still processing the news. Unfortunately, I lost the pregnancy about 2 weeks after the incident. So emotionally, I was already a mess. This new job involved waiting tables for about 6 to 10 hours a day, and anyone who's experienced morning sickness knows it doesn't just happen in the morning. I was nauseous most of the day and incredibly tired, which didn't help me stay as alert as I'd like to be. Despite feeling exhausted, I did my best to appear focused and ready. I woke up early, threw on my long-sleeve black slacks, no-slip shoes, and got ready for my first day. On my first day, I was introduced to the other employees. One guy in particular stood out immediately. He was probably in his mid-40s to early 50s, overweight with dark, unkempt hair and a beard. He wore glasses and had no expression on his face. He stared at me like he was trying to control me with his eyes, studying every part of me. To this day, that memory still gives me chills. I should also mention that I look younger than I actually am when I'm not wearing makeup. Everyone assumed I was 16, and since I'd never been formally introduced to this man, he probably thought I was 2. I didn't see the point in correcting them because I was used to being mistaken for younger when my arms were covered up. Throughout my entire shift, I could feel his eyes on me no matter where I went in the restaurant. I would turn to the kitchen, and there he was, his deadpan, cold stare locked on me like a heat-seeking missile. For the most part, though, on my first day he didn't approach me, he just watched. Still, that was enough to make me feel uneasy. I also noticed him having conversations with my manager, glancing at me, and then talking again. At first, I thought it was just the hormones making me paranoid. I told myself I was probably being overdramatic. But as the day went on, I informed my manager that I'd need to leave right at closing since I had to catch the bus. If I missed it, I'd be stuck until the one that came close to midnight. He agrees and says it won't be a problem. He also mentions that I am dressed so formally and casual is best. So the next day, I decided to just wear the same thing I saw my other female coworkers wear and I come in for my shift. I am wearing all black short-sleeve t-shirt, black yoga pants, non-slips, and my apron. I also happen to have multiple tattoos, most of which are on my wrists, forearms, and inner arms. Not a full sleeve, but pretty visible. To most of the coworkers, this was enough to show them I was in fact over 18, but it also made me more interesting of an object to leer at during my shift for him. As I was restocking some of the sauces we put on the table, he approached me and stared me down intently. I looked up, started to see him so close to me, and just said, "Yes." He just stared at me for a few seconds and said, "Want coffee from me?" We had a machine we used to make various coffee drinks that we kept in the back, so I assumed this was what he meant and said, "Okay, sure, thanks. I appreciate that." He seemed really content and just walked away without another word. He never actually brings me any coffee, and I think this is kind of weird, but just go back to doing my job. A few hours later, and it's finally time I can take my lunch break, so I quickly place my to-go order and run to the bathroom to change into a sweater. When I come back from changing, my food is ready and he hands me the food, and I notice that there is a piece of paper on top and that he is smirking at me, then looking to my manager with a smile. I realize later that the piece of paper is his phone number. When I come back from my lunch, I am asked by my manager to go into the storage unit behind the restaurant and grab cases of soda to restock the fridge. I agree and head back. This storage unit was basically a metal shipping carrier that was in the parking lot behind the restaurant. There was one big heavy metal door to get in and no light on the inside. While I was in there, I had my back turned to the metal door while I was knelt down looking for all the cases of soda on the shelves. Hey, my heart nearly stops and I let out a sharp squeak of terror and quickly turn around to see him. I chuckle half-heartedly to try and make it seem like I wasn't on the verge of passing out and just quickly ask, "Am I in your way?" Silence. I slowly stand up and brace my back against the wall of the shipping container, slowly realizing that I may not be in the safest position right now. "You never texted me," He slowly starts to move towards me and I half cry, half shout, "I have a boyfriend." Dead silence again. He simply slams his fist into the shipping carrier door and walks out without a word. His shift ended 1 hour later. Mine was set to end in another 5 hours. He seemed to have left and I got through the rest of my shift almost completely without incident. I noticed the car in the parking lot of the restaurant going out through the entrance and think, how stupid. Why would they go that way? The car goes towards the intersection and U-turns to be driving the same way I'm walking. At this point, it's about 10:30 p.m. I had just finished closing up and began walking towards my bus stop only about a mile away at the train station. As I am walking, I stay on the phone with my godmother and walk along to the train station. As I reach my stop, I realize that there is a car that keeps circling. I had noticed it while I was walking from my job, but thought that it must just be because I was on a straight road for so long. And when I noticed the Lyft badge on it, I assume it's just someone looking for their passenger. I know that it can be dangerous waiting at night by myself since the trains had already stopped running that night and I had another 30 or so minutes before my bus would arrive. I keep pepper spray and a small switchblade as well as a whistle in my backpack for this exact reason. I place my backpack down next to me on the bench and pop in one of my earbuds so I can have my playlist queued up and ready to go when the bus arrives. 15 more minutes go by and I see the car circle again. Another 10 minutes and it pulls up directly in front of me. I take out my earbud to preemptively say, "I'm not your passenger. Sorry." The window on the car rolls down and I see him. "Get in," he demands quickly. I'm dumbfounded and freeze. "No, thank you. My bus will be here soon." He smiles eerily. "Don't you see who it is? You know me. Get in." I tense up. "No, I really don't want to. Please leave me alone." My voice is shaking and breaking on every word. I reach slowly from my backpack and freeze. "Get in the car." I feel my entire body lock up and I want to scream, but nothing comes out. I hear his door unlock and I start to panic thinking this is going to end very badly for me. As I watch the bus pull in, I saw the driver's side door of his car slam shut, and then he sped off down the road in a hurry. My heart raced as I ran onto the bus, quickly taking the closest seat to the driver. When I finally got to my room and saw my boyfriend, I broke down. I collapsed into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. The entire bus ride, I was shaking, fully realizing what had just happened. That he had followed me in his car for a mile to the bus stop, then circled around and waited until I was completely alone. I felt so ashamed, as if I should have known better. I had all the safety measures I thought I needed, but in that moment I froze. The guilt and fear overwhelmed me. The next day I went to the police, and while they agreed that the situation was extremely concerning and that he might escalate, they told me there was nothing they could do unless he explicitly stated he intended to harm me or stalk me for at least 48 hours. I was devastated. But at the same time, I knew I had to stay far away from him. I quit my job the following day, via text, because I wasn't about to go face him in person. The cemetery I oversee is incredibly old, probably several centuries old. It's at least that old, considering the church next to it was built in the 17th century. Being in a fairly remote area, most of the graves from back in the day only had wooden crosses marking them, no stone or marble monuments. Over time, those crosses have rotted away, and new graves have been dug. With fewer people living in this rural area now, the cemetery is overgrown and neglected. As you can imagine, when you're continuously burying people in the same small plot of land for hundreds of years, the soil gets worked over again and again. Eventually, it's mostly just bone fragments. You can't even rake the flower beds without unearthing bits of teeth, finger bones, or other remnants of human remains. Beneath the thin layer of grass, it's essentially just a patchwork of fragmented skeletons. The dirt there is similar to what you'd find near a beach, except instead of crushed shells, the lighter colored bits are pieces of bone. It's not so much scary as it is just unsettling, but you eventually get used to it. You learn to treat any human remains with respect, burying them out of sight under the plants you're working with. So, one day, someone was tending to their relative's grave and decided to clear the area around it. People here seem to prefer smooth, flat ground over grass, often using a rake to create Zen garden-style patterns. While they were raking, they pulled up a mass of pure white hair from the dirt. Understandably, they must have panicked and ran off, leaving the cemetery worker to find hair sticking out of the ground. She reported it to the church, and they supposedly reburied whatever was left. Even with all my years in the industry, I still don't know how a body could be that close to the surface. But there's another experience that haunts me even more than that. My business partner and I had just returned from a house call for a young woman who had passed away at 27. While we were transferring her body from the cot to the embalming table, we heard a distinct click, and suddenly the radio in the corner of the room blared static at full volume. It was one of those old radios that turns on when you click the volume dial. We both froze and exchanged pale looks. My partner, who was very religious, was visibly shaken and quickly found a reason to leave early. I turned off the radio, as I usually used my phone to listen to music while working. After I finished embalming and was about to move her to the dressing table, I heard that same click again, and the radio blared full volume once more. At that point, I was seriously freaked out and left shortly after. My partner and I never spoke of it again, and nothing like that ever happened again, to my knowledge. I moved across the state to a newly built house after my previous landlord decided to sell his property. When our lease ended, he kicked me out. I chose to lease this new place, and I was genuinely excited about it. But soon after moving in, I started noticing my neighbor across the street staring at me multiple times within the first few days. He was a middle-aged man who always seemed to be home. At first, I tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe he was just curious about the new person in the neighborhood. But the more I saw him, the more I began to sense something was off. He never spoke to anyone, never smiled, and never left his house. He just stayed there observing. I'd catch sight of him through my window, standing in his driveway at strange hours of the night. Started to creep me out. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a scraping noise from outside, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I peeked out the window and saw my neighbor dragging what looked like a large ladder across his lawn. It was really late, and I couldn't figure out why he'd be doing any work on his house at that hour. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, being in a new place and surrounded by unfamiliar people, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with my neighbor. I tried to calm myself and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I saw him outside again. This time, he was standing at the end of my driveway, staring at me through my window. I quickly pulled the curtain shut and tried to ignore him, but the thought of him watching me made my skin crawl. I didn't like that he was standing so close to my driveway either, so I hurried into my car and pulled out of the garage. By the time I drove off, he had gone back to his yard, but he still watched me as I left. Things got much worse after that. One night, as I was lying in bed, I clearly heard footsteps in the grass in my fenced-in backyard. I got up and looked out the window, but the footsteps stopped. I waited in bed for about 30 minutes, but I didn't hear anything else. Just to be sure, I checked the window again, and there, far back in the yard, I saw a figure. It was hard to make out details because it was so dark, but there was definitely someone standing there, watching me. I backed away from the window and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. I explained everything about my creepy neighbor, but they told me there was no evidence of any crime, and my neighbor had no prior issues with the law. Essentially, I was left on my own unless something more serious occurred. I began locking all my doors and windows, staying inside as much as possible. Even then, I didn't feel much safer. I had been in the new house for almost 2 weeks, and I even considered breaking my lease. Then, one night, something happened. I got home from work late and went straight to bed. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of something thudding against the side of the house. It sounded like it was right next to the wall outside my bedroom, which was on the second floor. My heart was pounding as I slowly got out of bed and pulled the curtains back. I froze and screamed when I saw my neighbor's face just inches away from my window. He was standing on a ladder, trying to look into my bedroom. He quickly climbed down and ran off. I called the police again, and just minutes later, they caught him trying to take the ladder down. While he didn't admit to his actions, it was painfully obvious what he had been doing. In the following days, one of my other neighbors stopped by and shared that they had also had strange encounters with the man. They said they'd seen him looking through their windows one day when they came home from work. Part of me wonders if they could have prevented all of this if they'd reported him sooner. But either way, it's over now. This happened last year. It was early spring, and the entire month had been filled with rain, from light drizzles to full-on storms. I do deliveries for a popular restaurant in my area, so rain wasn't exactly ideal, especially since I was constantly running through it to pick up and drop off orders. This night started like any other. I arrived at work at 6 p.m., completed a couple of deliveries, and then received one that would take me a bit farther out, about 10 miles from the restaurant, heading into a more wooded area of town. It wasn't all forest or anything, but the area was much more spread out and sparsely populated. The roads were lined with trees, and most of the neighborhoods weren't visible from the main roads. As I was driving, there was only one car behind me, which wasn't unusual given how empty the road was. But about 2 miles in, a beam of headlights suddenly appeared in front of me, and I saw a car swerving into the middle of the road and coming to a stop. I slammed on my brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. The car behind me did the same, stopping so close that I was surprised we didn't hit each other. After the initial shock, I looked up at the car blocking the road. It was an old sedan with the brights still on, blinding me and making it impossible to see the driver. It seemed like the person in the car must have either been falling asleep at the wheel or not paying attention, but they intentionally turned on their headlights at the last moment when they swerved into the road. I couldn't tell where they had come from. It was too dark to see if they had been driving down the road or if they came from a side path. The driver behind me honked their horn, clearly frustrated. I probably should have been more cautious, but in a moment like this, it's hard to think clearly. Regardless, the car behind me was too close for me to reverse, and the car in front was blocking the way forward, so I couldn't go anywhere unless one of them moved first. After a while of honking, the driver behind me got out of his car. I glanced in my mirror and saw a large man walking through the rain toward the car in front. He looked furious as he passed right by my car and walked up to the other. He stood at their window, angrily yelling at whoever was in there. But with the rain, I could barely hear what he was saying, and I couldn't hear anything at all of what the other person was saying, if they even were responding. I saw the man outside bang on the window a few times as he yelled, but then he suddenly stopped and went quiet. He slowly backed away from the window, then nervously walked back to his car. As he was getting in, the driver's side of the other car opened. A man stepped out wearing a thick hoodie that covered most of his face. I was now getting really freaked out and still had no way of leaving other than running out of my car and into the woods, which was probably a terrible idea. So I sat there and watched as the man quickly made his way up to the car behind me. But just as he got to the door, the car floored it backwards. Their tires screeched as they slid against the pavement, losing control and sliding off the road. They made it past a few trees before eventually slamming into one further into the woods. The man that was still on the road turned and looked at my car, making eye contact with me in my side mirror. Horrified, I put my car in reverse and pressed on the gas, backing out past him, then turned around and sped off. I obviously called the police, but still had no idea what was really going on there. That night, an officer got to the scene about 15 minutes after I'd left, and the only thing there was the car wedged in the woods against a tree. The other car was gone, and neither of the men were there. I think we can all assume what probably happened without even having any reasoning to go off of, but there's still a million questions that need answers. All I can say is that if the other guy behind me wasn't there, I likely would be in his place right now. I don't know what made me decide to share this now, but I've been thinking about it a lot these past few days. It's something that still sticks with me because it was the first and only time I truly felt like my life was in danger. When I was around 8 years old, My parents were going through a divorce, and my older sister and I spent a lot of time at our grandparents' house. It was a long, ranch-style home on a corner in a nice neighborhood, just a 10-minute walk from a gas station, a grocery store, and a few fast food places. The streets were long and lined with well-kept houses, all surrounded by the scenic hills of the California Valley. We weren't wealthy, but my grandpa had bought the house as a fixer-upper many years ago, and the property value had skyrocketed since. As you can imagine, it was a very safe area. There weren't many kids around, but it wasn't unusual to see neighbors walking their dogs or pushing strollers up and down the sidewalks. Although my mom was always protective of us, especially after the divorce, this neighborhood was dense with families, and my family knew just about everyone who lived there. My mom had grown up in that neighborhood, so she trusted the area. Every once in a while, she'd let my sister and me walk to the local Rotten Robbie gas station at the end of the block to grab a snack. I would always get a ring pop, and my sister would pick out a Three Musketeers bar. It felt like such a big deal for us, even though my sister was 11 at the time. Nothing compared to walking down that street in the summer, laughing and joking around, a couple of dollar bills in our pockets. It made me feel like I owned the world. There was one strange thing I always noticed in the neighborhood, though. On the side of the road opposite the gas station, right by the back fence of another house, there was a small camper. It seemed to just sit there permanently, its windows always covered by opaque beige curtains. For some reason, it gave me this deep sense of unease every time I passed it. I was almost certain someone was living inside it because sometimes I could hear the air conditioning running, yet the camper stayed in the same spot. The hairs on the back of my neck would always stand up when I passed it, especially when I walked by the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that one day, it might swing open just as I walked by. What bothered me most, though, was a drawing taped to the inside of the door. It was a messy sketch in brown-colored pencil, filled with odd, tangled lines that didn't make sense. I could barely make out a vague shape, but I could never figure out what it was supposed to be. I never had the nerve to stop and stare long enough to really look. Every time I passed the camper, I'd sneak a quick glance. About a year before the incident I'm about to describe, I was walking with my mom past the camper after we'd gone to the park nearby. We had to pass it before crossing the street, and I didn't want to seem scared, so I stayed right behind her and didn't object when she walked past it. That time, though, I felt a bit braver. I had become frustrated with not being able to decipher the drawing for so long. While my mom was a few feet ahead, I stopped in front of the camper door and took a moment to really study the drawing. Upon closer inspection, the paper was dirty, almost like it had been aged. It reminded me of a project I did in elementary school where we soaked printer paper in coffee to make it look old. My mom kept walking, unaware that I had stopped, but my eyes stayed locked on the scribbled mess on the paper until, slowly, I could make out what seemed like a tiny, misshapen face. My stomach dropped. I felt cold and disgusted as my eyes scanned the rest of the image. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, I can say now that it was a distorted fetus, surrounded by large, perfect circles, like those made with a circular ring ruler. Its face was twisted, as if in pain. The image was so graphic and disturbing, it lingered in my mind for days. As a child, I didn't know how to process it, and the mental image still makes me feel sick. I had never seen anything like it before. Adrenaline surged through me, and I felt a tight knot of fear in my chest. But instead of saying anything, I selfishly thought about the excitement of my ring pop trips, and I stayed silent as I hurried to catch up with my mom. Looking back, I realized that was a terrible idea, one of those decisions you scream at the characters to avoid in movies. Ever since that moment, my unease about the camper was heightened by the disturbing drawing, and I thought about it every time we drove past. About a month later, my mom gave me and my sister a few bucks and permission to walk down to Rotten Robbie to grab our snacks. I considered telling my sister about what I had seen, but she was older and braver, and I was terrified she would make me cross the street to check it out. It was a sunny day, and I convinced myself with false certainty that nothing would happen. I thought if I just ignored it, maybe it would go away. We walked past the camper, and it was thankfully uneventful. But on the walk back, I felt more at ease, focused on struggling to open my candy wrapper until my sister walked up beside me. We passed the camper again, but I didn't give it nearly as much attention as I had before. I can't recall what we were talking about, but I remember being cut off mid-sentence when my sister softly but firmly said my name. There was a distinct fear in my sister's voice that instantly set me on edge, like a bucket of ice water being poured over me. All of my senses sharpened, and I became hyper-aware of everything around us, including the sound of hurried footsteps about 10 feet behind us. It was accompanied by a heavy rustling, like someone carrying a large, overloaded backpack. Nervously, I turned my head slightly to look, and I saw a man with a long, unkempt beard, dressed in multiple layers of ragged clothing. His eyes were unmistakably fixed on our backs as he walked. His movements weren't normal. He shuffled like a drunk, each foot seeming to require an enormous effort to lift and move, as if he could barely manage to take a step. His shoulders were hunched, his head hanging low, and his neck curved unnaturally. I could hear his shoes scraping against the gravel with every step. But instead of seeming genuinely intoxicated, it was as though he was deliberately stumbling in our direction, like a zombie intentionally trying to scare us. And then I saw it. The camper door was wide open for the first time in all the years we'd lived there. It hit me like a punch to the stomach. This was the man who had been living inside. "He's following us?" I choked out, tears welling up in my eyes. My mind raced as I stared straight ahead again, taking in the wide, empty street and sidewalks that felt eerily deserted. My sister grabbed my hand, squeezing it so tightly it hurt, her gaze fixed ahead, her voice barely a whisper. "On the count of 3, we race home," she said, her tone grave and serious. I couldn't even respond through the lump in my throat, but every part of me understood that we had to put distance between us and this man as quickly as possible. She began to count steadily as we quickened our pace. But the most terrifying part was that he started running before we even had a chance. He must have heard her whispering to me and tried to get a head start, sprinting toward us before she finished counting. His footsteps were loud and clumsy, and we bolted like deer the instant we heard him behind us. I'll never forget how that felt. The chase was exactly like a nightmare. The fear that your pursuer is mere inches away from grabbing you, from pulling you into the darkness. In my mind, I pictured myself being dragged into the van with no one around to see or hear me. We ran so fast, I couldn't even muster the breath to scream. And when I dared to look back about 10 seconds later, I saw him running after us with none of the staggering, zombie-like steps he had taken earlier. It dawned on me then, he might have been faking the limp, deliberately pretending to be handicapped to lower our guard so we wouldn't start running. The thought chills me to this day, but I can't think of any other explanation. We made it to my grandparents' house and, without a second thought, yanked open the old, stubborn door, slamming it behind us as we scrambled past their excited dogs and into the safety of the house. I don't even think we locked it. Our only priority was to get into view of any adults as quickly as possible. My mom was sitting at the table chatting with my grandpa and gave us a bemused look as we bolted into the living room. Since we were kids, it wasn't unusual for us to run around. So she didn't ask what had happened as we collapsed onto the couch, trying to catch our breath. The inside of the house felt safe, and the upbeat energy made me not want to bring up what had just happened, like waking up from a nightmare that you'd rather forget. I wanted to get back to normal, to erase the memory, unwrap my candy, and pretend everything was completely fine for the sake of my own sanity. And that's exactly what I did. A few years ago, I asked my sister if she remembered the incident, and her response was odd. She immediately recalled it without me giving any details, but then quickly dismissed it, insisting that the man must have just been a bored homeless person looking to scare some kids and had no real intention of harm. I don't know. I'd like to believe it was an innocent misunderstanding, but, as they say, gut feelings are rarely wrong. I can feel deep down that he meant to harm us that day. I never told my sister or anyone else about the strange drawing on the door, and I'm not sure if my sister saw the open camper door and connected him to it or not. It's one of my biggest regrets because I would hate for any other kids to have been less fortunate after innocently walking past that camper in the shade. I think he chose that spot deliberately between the park and the gas station because of how many children walked through that area. After that day, I never saw the camper again. I'm not proud of how I handled things, and I would encourage anyone in a similar situation to contact the authorities immediately for the safety of others. I don't know if this story sounds melodramatic, but it was very real and very terrifying in a way I can't forget. The house had been empty for years, a forgotten relic on the outskirts of town. It stood abandoned, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling like dead skin. No one remembered who had lived there last or why they had left so suddenly. But I had always been drawn to it, compelled by the stories whispered among the townsfolk. One night, I decided to go inside. The front door groaned as I pushed it open, the air thick with dust and age. My flashlight flickered as I stepped across warped floorboards, the house settling around me like it had been waiting. The walls were lined with old furniture draped in white sheets, shapes of forgotten memories frozen in time. Then I found the mirror room. At the end of the hall, past a door that should not have been there, was a room filled with mirrors, floor to ceiling, covering every wall, reflecting each other in an endless loop. I hesitated at the threshold. My reflection multiplied infinitely, stretching into oblivion. A whisper rose from the depths of the mirrors. "You're not supposed to be here." I turned sharply, but there was no one behind me, only my reflection, and yet, something was off. The copies of myself in the mirrors weren't quite right. One of them was staring directly at me while the others followed the natural movement of my body. Its eyes were hollow, darker than they should have been. Then it smiled. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The air in the room turned cold, my skin prickling as the reflections began to move on their own. My mirror self stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its grin stretching too wide. "Let's trade places." The lights flickered, the mirrors trembled, and then, one by one, the reflections started to walk out of the glass. I ran. I didn't look back. I tore through the house, the air heavy with whispers and the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. The front door slammed shut before I could reach it, the mirrors along the walls shuddering violently as laughter echoed from within them. A hand, cold and smooth like glass, grabbed my wrist. I woke up outside. The house stood silent, unchanged. My hands trembled as I scrambled away, my breath fogging in the cool night air. I looked down at my reflection in a puddle near the sidewalk. It grinned at me.
The nightmare started that night.
Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that room, surrounded by endless reflections of myself, distorted, wrong. They moved when I didn't, their grins widening, their eyes watching. I stopped looking in mirrors, covered every reflective surface in my apartment. But that didn't stop the whispers. They were with me now. At work, I caught glimpses of movement in my computer screen that weren't mine. At home, I'd see shadows shift in my peripheral vision, flickers of a presence just outside my reach. My reflection lingered just a little too long when I turned away. Then the notes appeared, scrawled across my bathroom mirror in smeared condensation. "Come back." On the surface of my phone screen when I woke up, "You belong with us." One morning, I woke to find my bedroom mirror uncovered. I swear I had draped a sheet over it the night before, and there, standing in the reflection, was myself or something wearing my face. But its grin was wider, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And as I stood frozen, unable to move, it raised a hand and pressed its palm against the glass. So did mine. My breath caught. I tried to pull my hand away, but my reflection stayed in place, palm still pressed against the mirror. Then it stepped forward, not out of the mirror, but into me. A cold, consuming force surged through my body. My limbs stiffened, my vision darkened. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then I woke up. In the mirror, I was trapped. I pounded against the glass, but the world beyond was still. My apartment, untouched. My body stood on the other side. It smiled at me, lifting a hand in a slow wave. Then it turned and walked away. Days passed, or maybe longer. Time didn't exist in the mirror. first, I screamed. I pounded the glass until my hands bled, begged for someone to hear me. But the world outside moved on without me. My body, whatever had taken it, continued my life. It went to work, spoke with my friends. It lived as if nothing had changed. I watched, helpless, as my reflection, now real, mimicked me perfectly, except for the smile that never faded. Then the whispering started again, not from the world beyond the glass, from within the mirror itself. I wasn't alone. In the corners of my vision, shapes moved. Other reflections, twisted, trapped like me, their faces contorted in silent screams, eyes pleading. Some had been here for years, decades, maybe longer. And then I understood. The mirror room had never been empty. It was a prison. A new face appeared in the glass beside me. My replacement. Someone else who had been lured to the house, drawn in by the same whispers. They stood, frozen, unaware. The glass rippled, and I smiled. It was my turn to walk free. I was working late one night in my office, trying to finish up a report that was due in a few days. I had some tea to keep me energized and was doing my best to get it all done as quickly as possible. Staying up late was something I was used to for work, but it had always been hard for me to stay focused when the tiredness started to set in. Around 11 p.m., while I was working in my office, I heard a knock at the front door. I got up and looked down the hallway, confused about why anyone would be at my door at this time. I walked down to the end of the house and peered through the peephole, but there was nobody standing outside on the porch. I took a step back, thinking that maybe it hadn't been the front door after all. I had been so focused on work, I wasn't sure where the knock had come from, but I assumed it was someone at the door. I didn't know what else it could have been, so I just went back to my office and resumed working. Maybe I should have been more concerned about the knock, but I was too tired and wanted to finish my report, so I let it slip from my mind after a few minutes. I stayed at my computer, typing away for almost an hour. The knocking didn't happen again, but I was getting more and more tired. My focus was slipping, and my eyelids were growing heavy. Just when I was about to call it a night, I reached over for my tea, and that's when I saw them. A pair of eyes staring at me through the window across the room. I could only tell it was a man, but he quickly ran away from the window as soon as I saw him. My heart raced, and I sat there, staring at the window in shock. It was so unexpected that I almost couldn't process it. After a moment, I stood up and rushed to cover the window. I had no idea who that was or why he was looking into my house, but the fact that it was almost midnight made the situation even more terrifying. I left my office and walked to the front of the house, checking the peephole again to see if he had gone to my front yard, but he was nowhere to be seen. I then checked a window at the back of the house, but again, there was no sign of anyone. My adrenaline was pumping, and I was wide awake now, but the silence in the house was starting to make me uneasy. Had the man left, or was he still outside? I went back to my office, grabbed my phone, and made my way back to the front door. I planned to call the cops while keeping my eyes on the doors and windows, but as I reached the end of the hallway, I froze. There, standing in the back of the living room, was a large figure. He was tall and wearing thick clothes to hide his identity, but his eyes were not the same as the ones I'd seen in the window. This was someone else. The man didn't hesitate, charging across the room at me as I turned and ran for my office, locking the door behind me and pressing my body against it, preparing for them to try kicking it down. As they approached the door, though, they slowed to a stop and just stood right outside of it. I could hear them breathing, then starting to walk back and forth like they were pacing in the hallway. But then I heard it again, a light knocking sound on the other side of the house. The man outside the door started to walk down the hallway, back toward the living room. Then it was silent. For a few minutes, then it was silent. For a few minutes, as I stayed there against the door, there was absolutely nothing. I called the cops, whispering into my phone and begging them to come quickly. I waited for about 5 minutes before I heard the sirens approaching my house. As they unlocked my front door and came in, there were no altercations. I heard them walk through the house and finally up to my door, and they never saw either of the men. To this day, I still don't know how the one man got in or what the two of them were trying to do. I think the knocking was their way of communicating from inside and outside the house. But then that makes me question what the first knock was that I heard. The whole situation freaks me out every time I think about it, wondering how long the one had been watching me for and how long the other man had been inside my house. Could have ended up so much worse for me, so I know I got lucky. But it's hard not to think about the possibility of them coming back. And luck isn't what I want to rely on for my safety. For context, I was just 5 years old at the time of this event, and I'm a male. My family had, and still has, a caravan on a fairly large site in Cleethorpes on the east coast of the UK. We used to spend pretty much every weekend there during the summer, and I absolutely loved it. We knew almost everyone with caravans nearby, and 2 caravans down from ours was an older man named Mike, who was about 60 at the time, and his wife, who had difficulty walking. My dad and Mike were good friends, having worked together at one point. Because of that, we would often visit each other's caravans and spend time together while we were there. I don't remember a lot from the day in question since I was so young, and my parents have been reluctant to share many details with me. From what I do remember, we were all sitting on Mike's balcony at the front of his caravan, and Mike decided to go inside to make drinks. According to my parents, he then asked me to go inside and help bring out the drinks or assist him in some way. I went inside, and I can still remember the exact moment when he put his hand over my mouth. I was reaching for cups from one of the low shelves when his hand covered my mouth in that classic horror movie way to keep me from screaming. At first, I thought he was just messing around. We did that sort of thing a lot, and I knew Mike had some sort of military background, so I assumed it was all part of a joke. But then, he started guiding me toward the back of his caravan. My memory becomes blurry here, and I'm not sure if I passed out briefly, but I do remember him still having his hand over my mouth. The next thing I remember is my dad bursting through the door, smashing Mike against the wall, grabbing me, and running out of the caravan. At the time, I had no idea what was going on, but I later found out that Mike had chains set up on the bed. Every time I think back to that moment now, it gives me chills, and I can't help but wonder why he would try something like that when my parents and older brother were sitting just meters away. My dad says he got us back to the caravan and then stormed back to Mike's. I don't remember any of that, and neither does my brother, but my mom has confirmed the story. By the time my dad returned, Mike had managed to get his wife in the car, and they just sped off. Apparently, they left their caravan unlocked, leaving behind all their belongings, and my dad said they never called the police because he wanted to beat Mike up, which I actually believe. Even at 62, my dad could easily handle himself. According to my mom, Mike and his wife never returned to the caravan, and it was replaced soon after by another family. We still have our caravan, but now that my brother and I have moved away, we only visit a few times a year. But when I look back, this is one of only 2 times in my life when I was in real danger. I still don't know what Mike was trying to do that day or why he would take me out the back when it was so obvious I'd be missed. But whatever the reason, it still creeps me out when I think about it. My ears were ringing and my eyes were straining painfully. I was laying on a slab made of cold metal and I was staring at the ceiling. I was paralyzed and cold. The ringing in my ears got worse and worse until it was nearly unbearable. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that haunts me to this day. Sliding slowly towards me was a hideous creature. It was completely brown with a large head. 2 large black eyes were bulging from its face. It had 2 pinhole nostrils, and beneath them, multiple folds of skin that may have been covered by some kind of mouth. The monstrosity had an arm protruding straight from its chest region. At the end of the arm was a large hand that included 4 fingers. When compared to a human hand, I would say it had 2 thumbs and 2 pointy fingers. The fingers were pointed straight out. I later found out that they bent into a knuckle on one hand. It had 4 long, thin legs that dragged behind it, and it moved towards me. As it approached me, the ringing got progressively worse. As it slowed and leaned over me, I saw that in its hand, it held a long needle-like tool. The creature put the needle in my mouth, and that's when I lost all consciousness. When I awoke, I was laying in about a foot of water in the shallows of the lake and I couldn't remember a thing. We paddled all day as if nothing had happened. And it wasn't until that night their memory came back. One of the leaders told me a story about aliens, and then everything became clear. I don't have any intention of going back into the woods ever again. In August 2008, I was in 9th grade and Facebook was really taking off. Like most kids at the time, my friends and I spent a lot of time on Facebook. One day, out of nowhere, I received a friend request from an account with an intentionally unattractive profile photo taken from the first page of a Google image search. The profile was almost bare, except for a few crude jokes and statuses. But it had over 500 friends, many of whom were mutual connections. I accepted it without thinking, as I accepted all friend requests back then, and forgot about it. About a week later, I got a single message from the account that simply said, "Hi." I probably replied with something like, "Hello," and didn't hear back, so I forgot about it again until I received another message. This time it said, "How was bowling?" The night before, my friends and I had gone bowling, and anyone who had me on Facebook could see that. After that, all of my friends received friend requests from this same account, and most of them accepted. I began getting more creepy but explainable messages. For example, the account would say things like, "I like your shirt," right after I posted a picture of myself. At first, none of it bothered me. I just brushed it off because I thought it was all stuff I had shared online. But then the messages started getting stranger, like, "When's your mom back?" and "What did you get from the shop?" After I'd been out, I figured it was one of my neighbors watching me. But then my friends told me they were getting similar messages, and things were getting worse for them too. The messages began including photos of my parents' car parked outside restaurants and shops, and one close-up of the house number at my front door. My friends were getting things like photos of family members' profiles and Google Earth screenshots of their houses, but nothing as alarming as what I was receiving. The creepiest thing I got was a photo of me outside my school. It was clearly taken from a car's driver's seat, because you could see the passenger door. Neither I nor my friends ever told our parents about this. I guess we thought we could handle it ourselves, being old enough by then. Around this time, I got a BlackBerry for my birthday, and the same day, I received a text from a 5-digit number saying things like, "Guess who?" and "New phone." They were using one of those old websites that let you text for free. The messages continued for about 3 weeks until I finally told my mom about the prank calls, and she got me a new SIM card. The messages stopped for a while. That's when things started getting even weirder. I began hanging out more with this kid from school who had been to my house a few times with other people, but we'd never hung out just the two of us. We started taking the train into the city to explore, and we usually ended up in a park near a shopping complex. We met up with a group of people our age who hung out in that park regularly. I really hit it off with a girl named Beth from that group, and we would talk for hours. I asked her to add me on Facebook, and we searched for my name on her phone. When she found my profile, her face dropped. We only had one mutual friend. Guess who? She told me that she'd been getting really weird messages about her and her friends for weeks, right around the time we met. For a few minutes, she was convinced it was me and got really upset until I showed her the messages I had been getting, along with the messages my friend had received. We ended up bonding over it, and she started texting and calling me whenever she received a message. Eventually, we got pretty close and even went on a date. We went to Nando's and walked in a park on the outskirts of the city. It was a really nice summer evening. Afterward, we went back to my house and hung out for the rest of the evening. We lost track of time, and before we knew it, it was around 11 p.m. My mom didn't want Beth walking to the train station so late, especially since she wasn't sure she'd catch the last train, so she offered to drive her home. We all got into the car and got to the toll tunnel that took us into the city. Mom said she was sure the car behind us had been following us for the past 2 miles, and this kind of freaked me out. But I didn't say anything. We lost the car in the tunnel, got to the city and made sure Beth got home safely and drove back through the tunnel. We stopped at a McDonald's a stone throw away from the tunnel so that my mom could get a coffee, and I think I got a McFlurry. And we were pulling out of the car park and I saw the car behind us, and I was 1% sure it was the same one from earlier. My mom didn't notice, but it definitely followed us from McDonald's all the way to our neighborhood, then turned up a different street right before we turned onto ours. But I didn't say anything. It had been a long day, and I went to sleep straight away. The next day, I woke up to about 15 messages saying some really messed up stuff. They were quite malevolent, but they weren't threats. Hope you had a good time, dickhead. You shouldn't be doing what you were doing. Did you screw her? These were the kind of messages that were sent. Bear in mind, I'm around 14 at the time. I didn't reply to any, and I didn't tell Beth because I really liked her and I didn't want to scare her away by it. She didn't say if she'd gotten any of the messages, but she did say about a week after that they had gotten a bit weirder, like detailing her dad's job. Eventually, this person got my new phone number and started texting me daily. They detailed where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. I made sure there was absolutely no way this information was being shared on social media. My phone's GPS was always off, and I rarely uploaded photos of what I was doing. If I did, then I'd wait a few hours before I uploaded it. By this time, most of my friends had stopped getting the messages, but it was just me, Beth, and my friend Kyle. Me and Beth dated for a few months, and then we made it Facebook official. I got a lot more texts. Most of them were blank, but they were all sent from that 5-digit service number. I started getting letters addressed to me that would be a blank piece of paper or just scribbles. I don't know how I managed to keep it from my mom not noticing. Beth and I broke up but remained really good friends. And it had been just under a year since the first message. And then everything, the texts, the calls, the letters, they all abruptly stopped. Beth and Kyle and I didn't get anything either. The Facebook account was deactivated about a month later. And to this day, I couldn't figure out who it might have been. I've eliminated all of my close friends. I feel pretty stupid for not telling anyone about it. Beth's family moved to a different city when we were around 17 just by chance. I saw her on New Year's Eve this year, and she told me that last year she and that her former roommate had some guy stalking them, calling them in the middle of the night, banging on their door. She said they called the police, and the guy was arrested the second time he came to their house, but she didn't know anything about him. She just said the things he would say on the phone reminded her a lot of what our stalker would say to her. Could it have been the very same guy? When I was living in El Paso, Texas, my mom and I rented a small apartment, just 2 rooms and 1 bath. It worked fine since it was only the 2 of us. I was around 8 years old at the time, and my mom worked graveyard shifts at a truck stop. She trusted me enough to stay home alone, giving me simple instructions like doing my dishes and going to bed at a decent hour. One night, she kissed me on the forehead and left. I had been watching SpongeBob SquarePants, and it was already really late, around 11 p.m. By then, I hadn't followed my mom's instructions. I hadn't done my dishes, and my bedtime was supposed to be 9 o'clock. I decided to go to bed, forgetting to check if the doors were locked. So, I crawled into bed, but instead of sleeping, I decided to read Alice in Wonderland. I'm not sure how much time passed, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, my book had fallen to the floor, and my nightlight was on. I was confused about why I was awake and decided to investigate. I walked around the apartment, wondering if my mom had come home early and made a noise. That's when I noticed that the front door was unlocked. Not thinking much of it, I started toward it to lock it, but when I went to turn the handle, it felt as if someone was twisting it from the other side. The door wouldn't lock if it was being held like that. As I struggled with the door, I suddenly heard breathing. It wasn't mine. My heart dropped. I started pushing against the door, terrified that someone was on the other side. Then I heard laughter, low, unsettling laughter. The apartment complex was usually calm, with no disturbances ever, so this felt completely out of place. I pushed harder on the door, tears starting to well up in my eyes. The laughter stopped for a moment and then turned into muffled, unintelligible words. Even though I couldn't make out what was being said, I could tell it was a man's voice. His tone was deep and raspy, sounding sharp and angry. At that moment, I started crying aloud, yelling something like, "I'm calling the cops." The laughter returned, but this time, the pressure on the door stopped. I locked it as fast as I could and ran to my room, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and called my mom, sobbing as I told her what had happened. She tried to calm me down, saying it would be okay and that she was coming home. But then I heard it tapping. It was coming from my window, and the laughter followed. By then, I was crying even harder, begging my mom to come home immediately. This is where things get blurry for me. I remember hiding under a blanket, crying, until my mom finally burst through the door, calling for me. I don't recall when the tapping stopped or when the laughter faded, but I vividly remember that was my first true experience with fear. We called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do. Eventually, we gave up and decided to move. My mom called the landlord, begging to move us to a second-story apartment. Fortunately, we were able to move the following week. This story is a bit unsettling and strange, and I didn't really think much of it until years later when I reflected on what really happened. I'm 30 years old now, but this all took place when I was 15. The evening started off pretty normally. A bunch of my friends and I were hanging out, feeling pretty cool because we were at the state fair without any adults. It was a group of about 10 of us, if I remember correctly. We decided to settle toward the back of the fairgrounds, where all the rides were. We were just talking, telling jokes, and trying to impress the occasional girls walking by. During our time there, we were approached by a very strange-looking man. He was of average height, a bit thick in the belly, bald with some hair on the sides, and had an air of confidence as he came up to us. He looked at us and, in a stern voice, asked, "You guys waiting for the ship as well?" Thinking it was some kind of joke, we all kind of laughed and asked, "The ship? What are you talking about?" We responded. The man smiled, showing his chipped teeth, and confidently said, "Yeah, the ship from space. Are you guys here to board as well?" Being the kids we were, we just assumed this guy had too much to drink or something. We laughed hysterically, brushing it off as just some weird joke. After we'd finished laughing, I finally asked him, "Where's the ship going?" "The Andromeda Galaxy, of course," he replied, completely serious. That was it. We were in stitches at that point, barely able to breathe from laughing. But then, the man seemed to realize we were laughing at him, and his tone shifted immediately. His confident voice became faint, and he said, "Go ahead and laugh at me. When they come, you will see." At this point, we all just brushed him off and walked away, thinking it was all some weird drunk guy's idea of a joke. But then he started following us, getting more irate and yelling something about aliens. We kept walking, not wanting to engage, but we could feel people staring at us. After a few minutes, I turned around and, in my blunt 15-year-old way, said, "Dude, leave us alone. We don't want any part of your ship or aliens." We were more creeped out than anything else, but still treating it like a joke. That's when the man stopped and yelled, "Stop!" We all turned to look at him, and with almost tearful eyes, he said, "I've seen you in my dreams. You've been on the ship with me. They chose us." At that point, we were officially freaked out. I pushed the guy away, and to my surprise, he went flying backwards, like he weighed nothing at all. Then, shockingly, he just started laughing. With all the commotion, we noticed a crowd had started to gather around us. Fairgoers had circled us, likely making sure things didn't escalate. The man started pacing around the circle, now asking people in a desperate voice, "Are any of you going up? They will be here soon. We need to get ready." The poor guy was met with laughter and confused stares. It was definitely one of the weirdest things I've ever experienced. I started to feel bad for him. It seemed like this person was really suffering from some sort of crazed delusion. While the man was interrogating the other fairgoers, we used the opportunity to make our way to the main entrance. Honestly, we were just done with the guy and done with the night. It was starting to get concerning, and we really didn't want any trouble or to have something happen that would need our parents to get involved. Once we got to the main entrance, we took a shuttle back to the parking lot where my mom was picking me up along with 3 of my friends. We got to the lot, and she was not there yet, so we just waited by the entrance to the lot until my mom got there. Right on cue, directly across from the lot, which is essentially a heavily wooded area, we saw the same guy just standing there, staring at us. We did not say or do anything to provoke him this time. We just watched and waited anxiously for my mom. As we stood there, we noticed that the man just kept pointing up to the sky. He didn't look like he was saying anything, but we wouldn't have been able to hear him if he was anyway, because he was probably at least 100 yards away. In the distance, we finally saw my mom driving up in our green Windstar van. As we approached the doors of the van, we noticed the man was now somewhat rapidly approaching us. Not running, but walking briskly, I would say. We started to move fast, not really knowing if this guy was dangerous or not. And as I got into the passenger side, the man waved from the side of the road, and I just barely heard him say, "I'll see you up there," as he smiled awkwardly at the van. It was not until years later when I was telling this story that I realized just how disturbing it really was. We had no idea if this guy could have caused us harm, if he was insane, or if by some crazy chance, there was some truth to his delusion. I often used to wonder what happened to that guy. I never saw him again. I still attend the fair every year, and honestly, I always go back to that spot at the back of the grounds to see if the strange man would ever come back. Either way, it was a very strange and interesting story I really wanted to share. Just makes you wonder what goes on in other people's minds and what their true intentions are. When I was around 7, something strange happened to my uncle that I've never forgotten. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but I think it's time to share what happened. I grew up in northern Michigan on a vast 5,000-acre ranch that bordered state land. It was all woods and fields as far as the eye could see. That lifestyle shaped us all into tough, resilient people, and it takes a lot to rattle any of us now. We're all hunters, fishermen, and lovers of the outdoors, and being the only girl, I was raised as a tomboy, and that's still how I am today. My uncle, after high school, enlisted in the military and became a senior NCO in an elite Special Forces division of the U.S. Navy. He was around 64 years old at the time, built like a wrestler and known for his survival skills. Nothing ever seemed to faze him. One time, when he was home on leave during deer season, we went hunting together. I remember him coming back to the house, shaking uncontrollably, crying, and saying he saw something in the woods. That was the last thing I expected from him. My uncle never cried. This was a man who would fight anyone who tried to get under his skin, and he was a rock, tough as nails. My grandmother tried to get him to make sense of it, but all he could say was that he had seen something that looked like a mix of Bigfoot and a wolf. That was enough for her to rush and get my grandfather. They gathered the other men. My dad, cousins, and my uncle, who, despite his fear, didn't want to be seen as weak, so he joined in. They grabbed their shotguns, ammunition, and saddled up the horses to clear the woods. I was too young to understand the gravity of what was going on, but they talked about something called the Dog Man, a creature I had never heard of. They told me to stay inside and not step out under any circumstances until they came back. My dad and grandfather had never been so serious, so I did as I was told and stayed hidden in my room. As the sun set, they still hadn't returned, and I started to get really anxious because they'd never been gone that long, especially not after dark. Soon, I heard the familiar sound of the horses running back toward the barn and voices calling out. I felt a wave of relief, but when they came inside, they were visibly shaken, though they didn't say much, probably to avoid scaring me. At dinner that night, my dad laid down the new rule. I was no longer allowed to play outside or go near the barns alone. I had to be with my grandfather at all times from then on. Of course, I was upset by this and felt my independence was being taken away from me, but I obeyed. The next morning, my dad and grandfather taught me how to shoot, and after that, I knew it was pretty serious. I actually overheard the adults talking the next night too. Apparently, there were tracks where my uncle had his sighting of this wolf thing, and that they were definitely dog tracks. As I said before, we're avid outdoorsmen and hunters, and we can definitely identify tracks easy, but this one, it was difficult to identify. And about 8 foot up in a tree were these claw marks. No Michigan bear could make those, and we also found claw marks of about the same height on multiple trees throughout our property. had cattle mutilated and not in the way a coyote or bear would, and it lasted that whole winter. We actually lost about 30 to 40 cattle that winter, and all of them were all with the same wolf dog tracks in the snow too. I really feel like this experience kind of changed my uncle. He did multiple tours in the Middle East for Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom before he, well, took his own life, but after that experience, he was just never the same. He went from not ever drinking to never seeing him without a bottle of Jack, and his eyes were always haunted. He changed his personality and never went out in the woods again. He quit hunting, and he eventually just quit coming home to visit on leave. He didn't even come home for my dad's funeral 2 years later. Honestly, it was heartbreaking to see him deteriorate the way that he did, and I truly believe that he saw something out there, and ultimately it did kill him. After my first year of high school, I moved to a different state. Since my parents had separated, I moved in with my mom. Once a month, I would fly back to visit my dad. Being 16, I traveled alone. When I arrived at the airport, I made my way to the terminal to wait for my flight. As I was sitting, I looked up and noticed a man staring at me. He wasn't disheveled or rough-looking, just an average older man, probably in his mid-40s. At first, I didn't think much of it, as I tend to zone out when I'm at airports. But when my boarding number was called, I glanced up again and saw him still staring at me. This time, he gave me a grin. It made me feel uneasy, but since there were plenty of open seats on the plane, I thought I'd sit at the back, hoping he'd pick a seat somewhere else. However, as I walked to the back, I noticed he was following me. He sat down right next to me. I had the window seat, and the middle and aisle seats were both open. Of course, he chose the middle seat. I could feel myself getting more anxious. This guy just didn't give off good vibes at all. He smiled at me, and I gave a forced smile, quickly turning my gaze to the window, hoping he wouldn't start talking. "Hey, my name's Jack. What's yours?" he asked. I froze in panic. "Riley," I responded, giving him my real name. "Riley, what a beautiful name." I just muttered a quiet thanks and continued staring out the window, praying he'd leave me alone. "What school do you go to, Riley?" His voice made my skin crawl. I really wanted to be as far away from him as possible. I replied, "I don't see how that's important." He raised his hands in mock surrender and chuckled, then started talking about his job as a college football referee. He even asked if I was a cheerleader, which made sense since I was wearing my cheer jacket. I just nodded, not wanting to engage with him anymore. Thankfully, another man came along and took the aisle seat, and Jack finally stopped talking to me. But he didn't stop staring. I turned my head away from him and pretended to be asleep, hoping he'd leave me alone. Eventually, I did fall asleep, only to be woken up when the plane began to land. A wave of relief washed over me, but it quickly turned to dread when I heard him say, "You're such a cute sleeper. I wish you hadn't woken up," accompanied by the creepiest grin I've ever seen. My heart stopped and my body went cold. I didn't say a word, just unbuckled my seatbelt and hurriedly stood up, trying to make it seem like I was in a rush to leave. When the aisle started to disperse out of the plane, he walked off and paused, looking back at me. I let 4 people pass me before stepping onto the aisle, and I saw rage in his eyes. He continued walking down the aisle with his head down. When I got to the front of the plane, I went to say thank you to the flight attendants and pilot like I always do. However, the flight attendant pulled me aside. She said, "Hey, do you know that man that was sitting next to you?" I shook my head, no. Her face went white. "When you fell asleep, he was taking pictures of you and telling us how cute his daughter was when she was sleeping. I was very puzzled because your body language was off. I asked her to walk me down to baggage claim, and she agreed since she had time to kill. When we walked out of the plane and into the airport, Jack was standing there waiting for me. She told me to keep walking, and I did. I ran into my dad's arms when I finally saw him. The man saw this and went the opposite direction. I don't know what his intentions were, but I am glad I never found out. I also realized that my school's initials were on my jacket, which makes me very nervous. The first night, I told myself it was just the house settling. By the third night, I knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't until the fifth night that I realized the truth. I wasn't alone in that sprawling country home, and whatever was with me wasn't human. It started innocently enough. My best friend, Sarah, had asked me to house sit while she and her husband took a much-needed vacation. Their home was a beautiful old farmhouse, nestled in the countryside about an hour outside the city. It was the kind of place I'd always dreamed of owning. Spacious rooms, a wraparound porch, and acres of land stretching out in every direction. "It'll be like a vacation for you too," Sarah had said with a laugh. "Just you, peace and quiet, and miles of nothing." If only she'd known how wrong she'd be. The first day was idyllic. I spent the morning exploring the house, admiring the antique furniture and the way sunlight streamed through the large windows. In the afternoon, I took a long walk around the property, breathing in the fresh country air and reveling in the solitude. As night fell, I settled into the cozy living room with a book and a glass of wine. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was close to midnight when I heard it, a soft thud from upstairs, like something heavy being set down. I froze, my book forgotten in my lap. Sarah had mentioned that their cat, Milo, was staying with a neighbor. The house should have been empty except for me. I listened intently, but the sound wasn't repeated. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old buildings make all sorts of noises, right? I finished my wine and headed to bed, pushing the incident out of my mind. The second night passed uneventfully, lulling me into a false sense of security. But on the third night, things took a turn. I was in the kitchen washing up after dinner when I heard it. Footsteps, clear as day, coming from the floor above. They were slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. My heart began to race. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone was in the house. I grabbed a knife from the counter and crept towards the stairs, my palms sweating as I gripped the handle. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" Silence. The footsteps had stopped. I climbed the stairs slowly, every creak of the old wood sending a jolt of fear through me. When I reached the top, I flicked on the lights. The hallway was empty, all the doors closed just as I'd left them. I checked every room, looking under beds and in closets, but found nothing. No sign of an intruder, no open windows, nothing out of place. I told myself I must have imagined it, that the silence of the countryside was playing tricks on my city-attuned ears. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fourth night, I decided to be proactive. I double-checked all the locks, closed every curtain, and even set up a makeshift alarm system with empty cans by the doors. I was determined to catch whatever or whoever was causing these disturbances. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a crash from downstairs. My heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and the heavy flashlight I'd placed by the bed. As I crept down the stairs, I could hear movement in the living room, the sound of something being dragged across the floor. I burst into the room, flashlight beams sweeping wildly, ready to confront the intruder. But what I saw made me question my sanity. The heavy oak coffee table was in the center of the room, exactly where it had always been, but the rug beneath it was bunched up, as if the table had been moved and then returned to its original position. And there, on the hardwood floor, were marks. Long, deep scratches that hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. I backed out of the room, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. Furniture doesn't move on its own. Floors don't scratch themselves. But I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't done this. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, lights on, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I seriously considered leaving. But the thought of trying to explain this to Sarah, of admitting that I'd been spooked by noises in the night like a child, kept me there. I was determined to see this through, to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation for everything that had happened. I wish I'd left when I had the chance. The fifth night started quietly, too quietly. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets chirping, the rustle of wind through trees were absent. It was as if the world outside had been muted, leaving only an oppressive silence. I was in the study, trying to distract myself with one of the many books lining the shelves, when I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature. The warm summer air turned icy, my breath fogging in front of me. Then I heard it, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a voice, but not like any human voice I'd ever heard. It was deep, resonant, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You don't belong here," it said, the words reverberating through my very bones. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Show yourself." A chuckle on low and menacing seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Oh, but I have," the voice replied. "I've been showing myself all along. You just haven't been looking properly." As if in response to these words, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. They stretched and twisted, taking on shapes that defied logic, limbs too long, angles too sharp to be human. I ran out of the study, down the stairs, heading for the front door. But as I reached for the handle, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and screamed. A hand, dark as smoke and just as insubstantial, had emerged from the floorboards. As I watched in horror, an arm followed, then a shoulder. The thing pulling itself out of the floor was only vaguely humanoid, its form shifting and roiling like a storm cloud. "Leaving so soon?" the voice mocked, now seeming to come from the creature itself. "But we've only just begun." I kicked free and yanked open the door, running into the night, the cool grass under my bare feet, the fresh air on my face. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I turned back to look at the house. Every window was filled with writhing shadows, pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. And there, on the porch, stood a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Where its face should have been was only darkness, deeper than the night sky. It raised a hand, long fingers unfurling in a mocking wave. "Run all you like," the voice echoed in my head. "But remember, I was here first, and I'll be here long after you're gone." I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. My feet bloodied, my lungs burning. A passing motorist took pity on me, the wild-eyed woman in pajamas, and drove me to the nearest town. I never went back to that house. I called Sarah from a hotel room, babbling some excuse about a family emergency. She was understanding, concerned even, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. How could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? It's been years now, but I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the echo of that unearthly voice ringing in my ears. I've moved to the city, surrounded myself with noise, light, and people, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror. A shadow moving where it shouldn't, a figure just at the edge of my vision. And I'll remember the last words I heard as I fled into the night. "I'll be here long after you're gone." So, if you ever find yourself alone in an old country house, and you hear noises you can't explain or see things that shouldn't be there, remember my story. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to be brave. Just run. Run and don't look back. Because some things are better left undisturbed, and some houses are never truly empty. This story takes place around the autumn months of 2014, and I'm still not sure what would have happened if my mom hadn't heard something, but I'm grateful she did. To help paint a clearer picture of what happened, I need to briefly explain the layout of my home. There are 3 entrances: the front, side, and back door, which was located in what used to be my bedroom. The back door had a glass window that offered a clear view of our quarter-acre backyard from my room. This might not sound like much, but in Salem, Oregon, that's as good as it gets. To get to the backyard, you had to walk down the driveway on the left side of the house, which made you visible to our next-door neighbors. That side of the house also had an old, brittle door from the 1940s. At the end of the driveway was our garage, and to the right of that, our backyard, as there was no gate at the time. This incident, along with several others, led us to put up a 7-foot fence. Now that you have an idea of the house's layout, you can probably see how something sinister could unfold, and indeed it did. But one thing is for sure, it could have gone much worse. This particular event took place in the early morning hours, between 2 and 3 a.m., as I've always been an insomniac. I was watching YouTube on my tablet, as most 13-year-olds do, when suddenly I was startled by a beam of light hitting the garage doors in my peripheral vision. Before even turning my head to look, I had already come to a couple of conclusions. First, the familiar circular beam of light was from a flashlight, and second, I had a weapon under my bed that I used for target practice just in case. I decided to wait and see who the light belonged to, as it wasn't uncommon for our neighbor to come into our yard looking for his cat. It was a good thing I waited because the flashlight was attached to a weapon held by a uniformed police officer, complete with a ballistic vest, taser, baton, and radio. Confused, I left my bedroom, expecting to see my mom sitting on the couch watching her favorite TV show, Bones. Instead, I saw my mother on the tips of her toes, leaning over the kitchen sink, looking out the window and peering, trying to get a view of the officer slowly and methodically creeping his way up the driveway and into our garage. Yep, he was definitely here for us, I thought as I began to ask my mom what was going on. Apparently, less than 15 feet away from my bed, a homeless person on who knows what had snuck into our backyard and accidentally kicked our glass recycle bin, alerting my mom, who was in the basement doing laundry. My mom tells me she then looked out the basement bathroom window where she saw the person making the kind of stance that one would trying to balance on a board, almost like the stance of a child would do when they are out of bed at late hours of the night trying to be sneaky to fetch a snack. Regardless of their feeble attempts at being stealthy, my mom had seen them, and they must have caught on too, because by the time my mom went upstairs to retrieve her phone, dial 911, and an officer arrived, they were gone. The cop told us that no one was in the garage or the backyard, and I could almost feel the anxiety lift off my mother's shoulders. Even more so when the officer offered to send someone over and survey the house until sunrise. So just to clarify, yeah, someone who wasn't supposed to be here was here. And not only that, but if they had gone 1 or 2 more steps forward, there's no doubt they would have seen me and I would have been none the wiser. You may be glad to hear that I am much more cautious nowadays. I have since updated my arsenal. We have also installed several security cameras, a fence in the backyard, and a motion detector light. I have a friend who recently got into reading entitled parent stories on Reddit. We talk about them, laughing at how ridiculous some of the situations seemed. But that was until last week. She started becoming quieter and more withdrawn. Eventually, I pushed her, and she shared something with me that's been on her mind. Turns out, some of the stories she's been reading about attempted kidnappings reminded her of an experience from years ago. We're still not sure if this is the right place to share it, but if anyone ever finds themselves in a similar situation, maybe it'll offer some insight on how to protect themselves. So, back in the early 2000s, my friend Sarah was attending the local state college. Although the college was in the city, she lived in the countryside with her dad and would use the bus to commute to school. One afternoon, after class, she and her friends went to one of their apartments to study for exams. They were responsible young adults, of course, so they studied for about 10 minutes before the atmosphere turned into more of a party vibe. A few hours later, Sarah glanced at the clock and her heart sank. She started cursing under her breath, mentally preparing herself to face the wrath of her father as she sprinted to the bus stop just in time to catch the last bus of the night. She finally managed to collapse into a seat at the back of the bus, letting out a sigh of relief, and threw on her headphones. Lost in thought, trying to figure out what kind of story to tell her dad. She didn't notice a little boy walking up to her until he sat down beside her. At first, she managed not to recoil, despite the fact that the child was filthy and looked like he'd stepped straight out of a horror movie. But it was his smile, wide and unsettling, that stuck with her the most. He just sat there, grinning at her, until she reluctantly slid her headphones off. "Hello? Hi. Hello. You're pretty." "Well, thank you. "What's your name?" Now, Sarah had a rule about never giving out personal information to strangers, but she figured a kid was probably harmless. Still, something about the situation felt wrong, and all her instincts were on high alert. So she lied. "My name's Katie. That's a nice name. I like it." And then the boy just kept sitting there, smiling. After a few minutes of this strange silence, the boy suddenly said, "You'd make a great mom," and hopped off the seat, walking back to a man who looked even worse, grimy, unkempt, and just as unsettling as the boy. He was smiling too. When Sarah looked at him, he nodded politely, still grinning, just like his son. She put her headphones back on, trying to distract herself with a book, but she couldn't shake the feeling of their eyes on her. No matter where she looked, both of them were smiling at her, watching her. As each stop passed, she prayed they'd get off. But when the bus started emptying, she realized it was just her, an older woman, and the two of them. The bus was now slowing down for a stop in a small town with a few restaurants. Sarah couldn't take it any longer. She decided it would be safer to get off and wait for her dad at McDonald's than stay on the bus with those two. She grabbed her stuff, ready to disembark, but as she followed the woman towards the door, she saw the man gathering his things too. Panic rose in her chest. "Hell no," she thought, but not wanting to make it obvious that she was avoiding them, she moved to a seat at the front and sat down. To her horror, the man and his son took seats near her and sat down again, still smiling and nodding at her. Anxiety surged through her as the bus made more stops. With every stop that passed, her fear grew. What was she supposed to do? Her mind raced with options, but nothing felt safe. When her stop finally came, she grabbed her things again, dreading the worst. She watched in disbelief as the man and his son did the same. But instead of getting off the bus, Sarah quickly sat back down behind the driver, heart pounding in her chest. "Excuse me, how much further until the end of the line?" 3 more stops. Sarah leaned in and quietly told the driver about the man and his son, asking if the police could meet them at the final stop. The driver looked at her in the mirror and assured her he'd handle it. Sarah turned around and her heart skipped a beat. While the little boy was still smiling, the father's expression had completely changed. It was the kind of look a parent gives their child when they've done something wrong. Like a "wait till we get home" look. Sarah, usually a strong person, was now in tears. She pulled out her phone and tried calling her dad, but it went straight to voicemail. Who else could she turn to? She finally decided to call her ex. He might have been a lousy partner, but when it mattered, he was reliable. She quietly explained the situation and asked if he could meet her at the last stop. "I'm at Rogers right now. It'll take me about 20 minutes, but I'll get there as fast as I can. All right? Please hurry," she begged. As the bus reached the final stretch, Sarah frantically searched for something that could help her, but there was nothing. The bus pulled into the stop, and the door swung open. The man glared at her, waiting for her to get off first. "Hold up, miss. I need to talk to you about your bus pass," he said. He stood there, blocking the door, but the driver told him, "This is the last stop. You need to get off." "I'm waiting for my sir. You need to get off now." "If you're waiting for her, she'll be along shortly," the driver insisted. Reluctantly, the man stomped off with his child in tow. As soon as they were off the bus, the driver quickly shut the door. But just as it closed, the man started banging on the windows, yelling. Sarah feared he might break the glass. Then, she saw 2 police cars pulling into the lot, followed shortly by her ex, Jack. The officers ordered the man away, though Sarah couldn't hear what was said. Jack later told her that the man was claiming that Sarah was his daughter and he was taking her home. But when Jack asked the man her name, and he said Katie, that was the moment everything clicked. In the end, the man got into a scuffle with Jack and the police officers but was finally arrested. When Sarah got home and told her father what had happened, he tossed her the keys to his old 1982 Ram and told her she was never riding the bus again. While the truck was loud and a bit of a hassle to drive, she never felt safer. However, she did make one final trip on the bus. After that night, when she delivered a plate of cookies to the driver who had, without a doubt, saved her life. so I have short-term memory loss issues, which can be annoying to say the least. Admittedly, there has been times where it bordered on dangerous. Just now, I was just driving through the back road that runs through the woods dividing my best friend's house and mine. It's one I've driven about 1,000,000 times as we've been friends for years. Most nights, I find the drive rather relaxing. The occasional deer, moose, or even bear might startle me along the way, but that's something I've grown used to. After all, these woods are practically in my backyard. I was maybe a mile into my drive home when suddenly, in what felt like a blink of an eye, I was flooded with absolute dread. I don't remember why. It was as if though I had woken up from a nightmare, and even though the memory was gone in an instant, something about it still lingered and the feeling of sickening panic had yet to fade away. I'm home now and even still I feel creeped out. Clearly, my body remembers something I don't. I don't scare easily. I'm a witch and an avid horror fanatic. At any given time, you can find me delving into something that gives the average person the creeps. Scary is kind of my thing. At least scary is usually my thing. Right now, I do anything to get this paranoia to subside. I've locked my doors and windows and gone all out in terms of paranormal protection. But it's hard to know how to protect yourself when you can't remember what you're so scared of. This happened in my early teens when I was 13 in 2009. And at the time, I was really depressed due to issues with my father. I would constantly listen to heavy metal and death metal and at one point wore Slipknot shirts with pentagrams on them. I was a full-on edgy teen. My room would be decorated with my art, and admittedly, I had a large painting of a demon that I personally painted. And now all this setup will lead to my point. Fast forward a year into my depression, and my mother is trying to get me through my emotional illness, telling me to dress in brighter clothing, and to listen to different music and get rid of my very dark decorations. By dark, I mean demonic decor and pentagram t-shirts. I was a skeptic at the time. Still am, but used to be stubborn and even more reluctant to believe. She would yell at me saying, "If you keep being like this, you'll attract negative energies to our house or even worse." I usually would dismiss this as my mother not wanting me to be depressed and a metalhead teen, but that soon would change. About 2 months later, the first encounter happened. I was sitting in the living room of the apartment we lived in. Now these apartments had sliding doors right in the living rooms, which led to small back porches. My computer was situated next to the sliding door. When I was 14, I was sitting by the door while my mother watched television. The sliding door was open because my brothers had gone outside. It was a typical dry, windless day in Arizona when, suddenly, the window blinds swung inward violently, like a gust of wind had blown them. I got up, closed the sliding door, and thought nothing of it, even though there was no wind. My mother, however, noticed and asked, "Ozuna, did you see that? That wasn't the wind." I was sitting right next to the door and hadn't felt any wind, so I dismissed it, but she seemed suspicious. This wasn't the only odd thing that happened, though. A week later, my family and I were in the dining room, which was next to the living room and kitchen since we lived in a small apartment. The kitchen itself was a narrow space with a stove, fridge, sink, and a small pantry with a sliding door. We were having dinner when, out of nowhere, the pantry doors fell off their track and slammed onto the countertop. Not wanting to give my mother the satisfaction of agreeing that something supernatural was going on, I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe the door had just broken and the wheel had come off the track. But when I tried to set it back up, I realized the door was intact and the wheel was fine. For the door to fall, someone would have had to pull down the small wheel to unhinge it. This definitely made me uneasy, but I stayed quiet about it. Later that night, after we had gone to bed, I heard my mother scream. I rushed into her room and asked what was wrong. She explained that she had covered herself with her blanket to stay warm when she felt the sheets tighten around her legs, as if hands were grabbing her. At this point, anyone else might have started to believe something was happening, but I was still skeptical. I chalked it up to her moving around in her sleep and making the sheets tighten. I went back to bed, ignoring her requests to throw away my demon-related stuff and pentagram shirts. 3 days later, I had been homesick from school all day, and I was bragging to my mother about how nothing strange had happened and how she was overreacting. But suddenly, the television turned on by itself, blasting the volume at full. I quickly turned it off, startled, but didn't say anything, even though my mother yelled, "See, Mizuna? It's that stuff in your room. It's attracting bad entities into our house." I brushed her off, still refusing to believe anything supernatural was going on. But inside, I was terrified. A few days later, I was having a good day, considering I was living with depression. I had eaten 2 whole pizzas and was feeling the urge to use the bathroom. The bathroom in our house was set up with the light switch right next to the door, and the sink was about 2.5 feet long, so you had to reach quite far to turn the light on. I was sitting on the toilet, lost in thought, when suddenly, the lights turned off. At first, I thought maybe the power had gone out, but then I heard a deep, gravelly voice laughing and say, "You're mine." That was the breaking point. I quickly finished up, ran out of the bathroom, and told my mother what had happened. A week later, I threw away all of my pentagrams, Ouija board, and the 4-foot demon painting I had made. We had a cleansing of our home, and thankfully, the strange activity stopped about a month later. I live near a freeway overpass, and most times, it's convenient for getting to the stores. One night around 10:30 or 11 p.m., with fog rolling in, I decided I was hungry and needed to grab some food. I could either cross the overpass or walk an extra mile to go around it. At the far end of the overpass is the city's biggest cemetery. So, I start walking, and halfway across the bridge, I spot a figure. A man dressed all in black, including a hood. It looked like he was wearing a hoodie or something, and I immediately felt uneasy, but I kept walking. Suddenly, I saw him jump over the edge of the overpass. I screamed, but all that came out was this strange coughing sound. I was terrified and instantly started crying. I ran to where he had jumped, thinking he'd have landed in the grass median dividing the freeway. But when I got there, I found nothing. Absolutely nothing. I kept looking, but there was no sign of him on the other side of the overpass either. No sound of a thud, no car honking, no screeching tires, just silence. I was sweating in the cold 36-degree air, completely panicked. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, and I kept going. I got my food and headed back. When I reached the end of the overpass again, a wave of dread hit me out of nowhere. Trying to calm myself, I focused on the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. Then I heard it, someone else's footsteps. I spun around, but there was no one there. I was the only one on the overpass. As I continued walking, I could still hear the footsteps following me on the wet ground. Every time I stopped, the footsteps would stop too. I picked up the pace and started jogging, getting about 250 feet from my house. Then the footsteps came again. I was about to lose it. The overpass was almost behind me, just before it met my street. There was a large puddle by the corner. I still couldn't see anything, but I could hear everything. I stomped through the puddle, ran across the street, and heard a splash right behind me, footsteps following. By this point, I was close to my house, but the footsteps didn't stop. I crossed the road and could still hear someone walking behind me. When I finally reached my driveway, I turned around and shouted, "You're not welcome here." Immediately, the footsteps stopped. The scariest part was fumbling with my keys, my hands frozen in fear, trying to unlock the door, feeling like something was about to attack me. I still don't know what I encountered that night, but it definitely gave me the chills. This was told to me by an ex-boyfriend of mine about 5 years ago. I don't remember his exact words, but I do recall the gist of the story. He lied to me often, but I wasn't dating him for his intelligence. It seemed like he genuinely believed this is what happened to him. As for what actually happened, I'm not sure, and I'm not about to ask him. I just wanted to know if this is something he made up, or if anyone else has had a similar experience with these creatures. Based on the smell and size, I initially thought it was a skunk ape, but after reading about skunk apes, I dismissed the idea. This occurred around 1995, probably in the spring, and I believe it was near a suburb southeast of Orlando. He told me he lived in the last house on a cul-de-sac in a predominantly Cuban neighborhood. My ex, who I'll refer to as X, said this happened in the woods near either an abandoned airport or a mall, though I think it was an airport. I can't remember exactly. One night, when he and two of his friends were in their early teens, they decided to go into the woods. I assume they had beer and were just looking for a secluded place to drink and mess around. They ventured deeper into the woods when X was the first to notice something strange. Then his friends also commented on it. It smelled like garbage. He described it as absolutely reeking of it. Suddenly, a blob of black sludge dropped onto X's shirt, stinking horribly. It was the same foul smell they had been detecting for several minutes. Then, in front of him, a very tall, roughly 8 foot tall, thin creature with red eyes appeared. It was covered in long, fine black hair. What he found the most terrifying, he said, was the way the creature landed. It dropped from a height, at least 10 feet in the air, and landed silently, as though it didn't disturb the ground at all, like it was some sort of illusion. Terrified, they ran home, but that wasn't the end of the story. In a rather foolish move, X decided to borrow his father's pistol, which, of course, wasn't properly secured, and returned to the woods to confront the creatures before they came out and caused any trouble. He wasn't sure if they were aliens or demons, but he didn't care. He found both possibilities frightening. So he went back alone after dark. It didn't take long before the same stench hit him again. Soon enough, the same creature dropped in front of him, about 5 yards away. X raised the pistol, ready to fire. But instead of attacking, the creature just stared at him. This is where I start to question the story. X suddenly felt that the creature posed no threat. He lowered the gun, and the creature dashed off into the woods. X gave chase. A quarter of a mile later, he found the creature in a clearing. But there were more of them now. A larger one stood in the center, alongside the smaller one he had been chasing. They appeared to be talking. The larger one was gray, much taller, and they both turned to look at X. The gray one raised a long, bony finger towards him. X said that while the communication wasn't audible, the message was clear. "It's all right. He won't hurt us." At that, the gray one lowered its arm. Outnumbered and scared, X ran. He never went back to those woods, alone or with anyone else. That's the story, and while I'm not sure if I believe it, he swore it was true. I've done my best to tell it as he did, refining it into something a bit more readable. Has anyone else had an experience with these creatures? About 6 years ago, my neighbors went out of town, and I was asked to take care of their fish, house, and pool. This also meant I had access to the pool whenever I wanted. So, of course, I did what any 20-year-old would do. I brought my girlfriend at the time over one night. It was a beautiful summer evening, no wind, and the moon was bright and clear without a cloud in the sky. We couldn't figure out how to turn on the pool lights, so we decided to skip it and swim in the dark instead. The moonlight was so bright, it almost felt like the pool lights were on anyway. The water looked like a sheet of black glass in the glow. Picture a peanut-shaped pool, with the shallow end where my girlfriend and I were swimming, and the deep end with a water slide at the other side. We were just swimming, chatting, maybe hugging a little. We stopped dead in our tracks when we heard deep breathing. We both looked toward the deep end, where the sound seemed to be coming from. In the moonlight, we could make out the dark silhouette of a head above the water, right by the slide. The sound was coming directly from that shape. Normally, that would have been terrifying enough, but what really freaked us out was the feeling that swept over us. It felt like someone had twisted a knife in our guts. There was this overwhelming sense that something deeply evil was there, and we had to leave. But we couldn't move. We just stood frozen, staring at each other, then looking back at the shape. In a split second, it was gone. No ripples, no change in the lighting, just vanished. And with it, the breathing stopped. We scrambled out of the pool, trying to see if someone was hiding there. Maybe we'd missed them in the dark, but there was nothing. We grabbed our towels and ran, faster than we'd ever run before. As I ran across their backyard and into the front yard, I saw my girlfriend ahead of me, And then, suddenly, I felt two hands push hard on my shoulder blades, sending me face first into the grass. But when I looked up, there was no one there. Even now, after all these years, when I tell people about that night, I don't remember being scared of the head, the breathing, or even the push. It was the gut-wrenching feeling that something was horribly wrong that scared me the most. My ex still won't talk about it to this day. The first snap of a twig could have been a deer. The second might have been the wind. But when I heard the third, followed by heavy breathing just outside the cabin window, a cold dread washed over me. I knew, without a doubt, that our weekend retreat had turned into a fight for survival. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing trip. My best friend, Jake, had found an incredible deal on a secluded cabin in the mountains. Just what we need, he'd said. A break from the city. No cell phones, no internet, just nature and good company. Our group of 5, Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, our friends Mike and Lisa, and me had eagerly agreed. The drive up was stunning, with winding mountain roads framed by towering pines and sweeping views that took our breath away. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the small clearing where the cabin stood. It looked rustic but charming, with a spacious porch and large windows that promised stunning views in the morning. That first evening, we spent our time settling in, unpacking, and exploring the cabin. There were 3 bedrooms, a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen stocked with the essentials. After a simple dinner of pasta and wine, we gathered around the fire pit outside, roasting marshmallows and telling stories under the vast sky. It wasn't until we were getting ready for bed that I first felt a sense of unease. As I was closing the curtains in my room, I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the clearing, a shadow darker than the night, which seemed to shift and vanish the moment I focused on it. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on too many ghost stories told around the fire. The next day dawned bright and clear. We spent it hiking nearby trails, marveling at waterfalls and meadows filled with wildflowers. By the time we returned to the cabin, we were tired but content, looking forward to another peaceful evening. That's when things began to feel strange. Small things at first. A chair on the porch had been moved from where we left it. A window we were sure we'd closed was wide open. Our firewood pile, which had been neatly stacked that morning, was now scattered, as though something had crashed through it. Probably just animals, Mike said with a shrug. Bears, maybe? We all agreed, happy to accept that simple explanation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As night fell, the feeling intensified. We were in the living room, playing a board game by firelight when the first twig snapped outside. We all froze, looking at each other with nervous smiles. Just the wind, Sarah said, but her voice trembled slightly. A few minutes later, another snap, closer this time. Jake got up to look out the window, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. Hey, I don't see anything, he said, but he double-checked the lock on the door as he sat back down. We tried to return to our game, but the mood had shifted. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every gust of wind outside, sent shivers down my spine. That's when we heard it. Heavy breathing just outside the living room window. It was too loud, too close to be anything but intentional. Lisa screamed, dropping her wine glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound impossibly loud and the sudden silence that followed. For a long moment, we all sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Then, slowly, deliberately, something started scratching at the window. We need to get out of here, I whispered urgently. Mike shook his head. The cars on the other side of the clearing. We'd never make it. He was right. Whatever was out there, it was between us and our only means of escape. The bedrooms, Sarah suggested, her voice shaking. We can barricade ourselves in. It seemed like our only option. We moved as quietly as we could, grabbing anything that might serve as a weapon. Fireplace pokers, heavy flashlights, a kitchen knife. We chose the largest bedroom, pushing a heavy dresser in front of the door once we were all inside. What do they want? Lisa asked, tears streaming down her face. Nobody had an answer. We huddled together in the center of the room, listening to the sounds of movement outside. Footsteps on the porch, the creak of floorboards in the living room. They were inside the cabin now. Hours passed like this, each sound from beyond our barricaded door sending fresh waves of terror through us. We took turns watching, trying to stay alert despite our exhaustion. It was during my watch, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, that I heard it. A new sound, different from the others. A rhythmic thumping growing louder. "Guys," I hissed, shaking the others awake. "Listen." As we strained our ears, the sound resolved into something recognizable. Helicopter blades. Hope surged through me. Someone had found us. We were saved. But our elation was short-lived. From just outside our door came an animalistic growl, followed by the splintering of wood. Whatever was out there knew its time was running out, and it was making one last desperate attempt to get to us. The dresser shuddered as something heavy slammed into the door. We pressed ourselves against the far wall, weapons raised, ready for a final stand. The door burst open with a crash, the dresser toppling over. And there, framed in the doorway, was a figure that defied explanation. It was human in shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, noseless, with sunken cheeks and eyes that glowed with an unholy, hungry light. For a heartbeat, we all stared at each other in horrified silence. Then the creature let out an unearthly shriek and lunged towards us. What happened next was chaos. We fought with a desperation born of sheer terror. I swung the fireplace poker wildly, feeling it connect with something solid. Sarah and Lisa were screaming. Jake had tackled the thing, wrestling with it on the floor. And then suddenly it was over. A deafening explosion filled the room as Mike fired the flare gun we'd found in the emergency kit. The creature howled in pain, its skin smoldering where the flare had struck it. It scrambled backwards, out the door, and down the hall. We heard the sound of breaking glass, and then silence. We didn't dare move until we heard voices outside, human voices, calling out. Park rangers, drawn by the helicopter we'd heard earlier. Apparently, the cabin's owners had contacted the rangers when we didn't check out on time. The rangers found us huddled in the bedroom, wide-eyed and incoherent, babbling about monsters in the woods. They were skeptical at first, but the condition of the cabin, the broken windows, the claw marks on the walls, was difficult to explain away. A search of the surrounding forest turned up nothing, except for some strange tracks leading deeper into the mountains. The official report chalked our experience up to a bear attack, combined with group hysteria and too much alcohol. But we knew the truth. In the years that followed, we poured ourselves into research, trying to make sense of what we'd encountered. We uncovered old legends of mountain demons, stories of hikers disappearing in those very woods. Nothing definitive, but enough to convince us we weren't just imagining things. We never returned to those mountains. How could we, knowing what lurked in their dark corners? Yet sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside my window, I can't help but think about that cabin, about the creature with glowing eyes and a twisted smile. And I wonder, is it still out there, waiting in the darkness, watching for the next group of unsuspecting travelers to wander into its domain? I hope not, but I always keep my doors locked, just in case. Because now I know that sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones born of our imagination. Sometimes they're frighteningly real, hidden just beyond the reach of the campfire's glow, waiting for the right moment to strike. So, if you ever find yourself planning a trip to a remote cabin in the woods, remember our story. Keep your eyes sharp, your wits about you, and maybe bring a flare gun, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting for its chance to attack. You ever get that feeling when you're about to do something, and a small voice in your head tells you not to? The subtle, barely a whisper, but it's there, urging you to stop. I felt that the moment we decided to rent the cabin. I can't really explain why. It was supposed to be a short getaway, something my girlfriend, Jessie, and I had been planning for months. But standing there at the edge of the woods, staring up at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we should have turned around. We found it online, one of those hidden gems people rave about in blog posts. Secluded, peaceful, and perfect for a weekend away from the chaos of city life. The pictures looked incredible. A cozy fireplace, a wraparound porch, and a view of the mountains that seemed almost unreal. But now, standing in front of it, something about the place felt off. Isn't it perfect? Jess said, her eyes lighting up as she grabbed our bags from the car. She didn't seem to notice my hesitation. I forced a smile, trying to push past the knot in my stomach. Yeah, perfect, I echoed, though the word felt empty coming out. The cabin was much older than it looked in the photos. The wood was weathered, the windows fogged with dust, and the porch creaked under our weight as we made our way to the front door. Still, it was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, like the forest around us was holding its breath. Jess didn't seem bothered. She unlocked the door and pushed it open with a groan from the rusty hinges. "Come on, let's get settled," she called over her shoulder. I followed her inside, my eyes scanning the room. The interior was exactly what you'd expect. Wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and furniture that looked like it had been through better days. There was a musty smell, the kind that comes from a place being closed up for too long. But otherwise, everything seemed fine. Still, I couldn't shake that unease. We spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking, exploring the area around the cabin, and trying to relax. By the time the sun started to set, I had almost convinced myself everything was okay. Almost. Jess had started a fire in the fireplace, and we sat on the couch, sipping wine and watching the flames flicker, the warmth slowly easing the chill that had settled into my bones. "You're quiet," Jess said, nudging me with her elbow. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound convincing. "Just tired from the drive." She didn't push it, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I wasn't usually this jumpy, and I knew I wasn't hiding it well. The night crept in, and the darkness swallowed the cabin whole. The forest outside became an impenetrable wall of black, and the silence deepened. We went to bed early, the exhaustion from the day finally catching up with us. That's when things started to get weird. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. Maybe the cold or the sound of the wind outside. But then I realized there was something else. A sound, faint but distinct. A slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone was walking on the porch. I held my breath, listening, my pulse quickening. The creaking continued, moving back and forth, like someone or something was pacing just outside the front door. I glanced over at Jess, who was still sound asleep, oblivious to the noise. For a moment, I debated waking her, but something stopped me. I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. Instead, I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. The curtains were thin, and through the small gap, I could see the porch bathed in the pale light of the moon. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty porch swaying slightly in the wind. The creaking stopped. I stood there for a long moment, staring out into the night, waiting for the sound to return. But everything was still, the forest silent once more. After what felt like forever, I went back to bed convincing myself that it was just the wind, just the old wood of the porch settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I didn't mention the noise to Jess. It seemed pointless. She was in a great mood, excited to explore the trails around the cabin, and I didn't want to ruin the weekend with my paranoia. So I shoved the thought to the back of my mind and tried to enjoy the day. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Everywhere we went, I felt eyes on us, watchful, hidden eyes lurking in the shadows of the trees. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't alone, that something was out there, just beyond the edge of our vision, waiting. Jess didn't seem to notice, laughing and chatting as we hiked through the woods, snapping pictures and pointing out wildlife. But I noticed every sound, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set again, and the uneasy feeling had only grown stronger. I wanted to tell Jess to suggest we leave early, but I knew how ridiculous it would sound. We'd only been there for a day, and there was nothing concrete at least, that should have made me feel this way. Still, that night, the creaking started again. This time, I didn't even try to sleep. As soon as I heard the first groan of the porch boards, I sat up, my heart racing. The sound was the same as before, slow, deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth. I didn't bother with the window this time. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and quietly slipped out of bed, making my way toward the front door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, the cold metal sending a shiver through me. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, not to look outside. But I did it anyway. The door creaked open, and I stepped out onto the porch, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air was cold, biting, and the forest was unnervingly still. I swept the light across the porch, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there. The porch was empty, but the creaking hadn't stopped. I turned, shining the light toward the far end of the porch. That's when I saw it. A faint shadow, barely visible in the beam of the flashlight. It moved slowly, swaying with the creak of the porch boards, but there was nothing casting it. No figure, no person. Just the shadow, dark and shapeless, pacing back and forth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow stopped, as if it had noticed me, and then, in an instant, it vanished. I stumbled backward into the cabin, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing so violently I thought it might burst. I had no idea what I had just seen, but one thing was clear: we needed to leave. Now, I woke Jess, trying to keep my voice steady as I told her we had to go. She was groggy, confused, but the panic in my tone must have gotten through. Within minutes, we were packed and in the car, speeding away from the cabin as fast as the winding road would allow. As we drove off, I glanced back one last time. The cabin stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth. I had felt it. I had seen it. When we got home, I tried to look up the cabin again, just out of curiosity, but it was gone. The listing had vanished, and there was no trace of it anywhere online. Even the blog posts that had praised it were wiped out, as if the place had never existed. But I know it was real, and whatever was in that cabin, whatever was pacing on that porch, it's still there, waiting. This happened a couple of years ago when I was 26. My single mother had just passed away, and being her only child, the house was left to me to either sell or move into. At the time, I was living in a terrible apartment because I could barely afford anything. After a lot of thought, I decided to move into the house. It was already paid off, so I'd be saving a good amount of money by moving in. My goal was to save up for a few years, get back on my feet, and then sell the house to buy the one I really wanted. Once my apartment lease was up, I moved across town into the house. It was located in a community of farmland owners, but over the years, most of the land had stopped being used for farming and was left as empty fields. That included my mom's land. The house itself was an old barn-style home situated in the middle of a large field, with only a small, overgrown path leading to it. During my first week there, I spent most of my time cleaning and organizing my stuff. One night, while I was cleaning, I heard a car coming down the path toward the house. I looked out the window and saw an old pickup truck driving toward me. It was strange because the only reason someone would drive all the way out here was if they were coming to the house. As the truck reached the end of the path, it slowed to a stop. I could make out a male figure in the driver's seat, but not much more. The truck sat there for a moment, headlights shining across the field, before doing a three-point turn and driving away. I thought maybe they had the wrong address or something, but it still felt eerie, especially so late at night. A few days went by, and by then, I had finished cleaning and getting everything settled in. It was a Sunday night, and I was staying up late, watching TV and enjoying a home-cooked meal when I heard that familiar sound again. A car driving toward the house. I looked out the window and saw the same pickup truck coming down the path, but this time, its headlights were off. I knew it couldn't be an accident this time, and I was starting to feel worried. I checked my phone and saw it was nearly 1 a.m. Why would anyone be coming here at this hour? The truck pulled up in front of the house and parked. A man got out and started walking toward the porch. I waited anxiously, but after a minute, there was no doorbell or knocking. I cautiously approached the front door and peered through the peephole. The man was standing right on the porch, staring directly at the door. I was terrified, as it looked like he was deep in thought, maybe deciding what to do next. Then, he turned around and went back to his truck, getting in quickly and driving off. Feeling creeped out, I called the police to report it, but there wasn't much they could do. I went to bed that night with a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. Unfortunately, I was right to be worried, because I woke up to what I thought was a knock at the door. It was just one knock. I jumped out of bed immediately and looked out the window, but the truck I expected to see wasn't parked outside. Quietly, I left my bedroom and started down the stairs to see who was at the door. But just as I reached the top of the steps, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I froze, and moments later, I heard footsteps walking through the hallway below me. I quickly hid in the spare bedroom that was next to me and dialed 911 as the footsteps grew louder and started coming up the stairs. They went straight into the main bedroom and I could hear them moving stuff around, like they were looking for something. I was too scared to speak to the officer on the phone, worried the intruder would hear me, so I just sat there silently. They spent a few minutes going through the bedroom before leaving and going back downstairs, and finally exiting the house. I started talking to the officer as I ran up to the back window to see if I could identify them before they got away. It was dark, but I could see that it was the same man who was on my porch earlier. He was walking in the backyard toward the field of tall grass, eventually disappearing in it. Police came by and tried to find any evidence to help with the case, but my description of the man was about all there was that was helpful. I don't know what that man wanted, but he seemed to be looking for something specific. It makes me think maybe he knew of something my mother had, and after hearing of her passing, he wanted to steal it. But once I realized he had to have known I was home and probably in the bedroom, it terrified me to think about how he still went in and looked around. What was he planning to do to me if I was still in there? I ended up selling the house a month later because I was too scared of him coming back. Even now, I still check every few months to see if there were any reports of recent break-ins at that address, but it's been quiet ever since that night. Just for some context, I'm a 23-year-old guy living in the Midwest, surrounded by woods and open farmland. I often experience sleep paralysis, but it doesn't tend to freak me out. Most of the time, I'll hear or see things that I figure are just my brain still half asleep. Not too terrifying. For those who haven't had sleep paralysis, it's essentially being awake but unable to move. Yes, it sounds scary, but when it happens to you almost every week, you kind of get used to it. Usually, I realize I'm in that state, so I try to move my arms or legs to wake up, and once I can reposition myself, I can usually get back to sleep. Changing positions helps. But there were 2 times that genuinely terrified me. The first was the very first time I had sleep paralysis. I was around 8 years old and living with my grandparents on a 26-acre plot out in the country. I had an old TV, one of those from the 80s or 90s that gave off static if you got too close. Anyway, one night, I was sleeping and heard the sound of metal scraping. I woke up to the TV's white static lighting up the room. In the room, there was a closet with a broken sliding door that could only be opened with a lot of force. Enough that, as an 8-year-old, I couldn't even open it. The scraping noise was the door sliding open, and I recognized it immediately because it was the same sound I'd heard whenever my grandparents needed something from that closet. I thought it was one of them, but it seemed odd that they'd need to open the closet at 2 or 3 in the morning, especially since it was just old clothes and random knickknacks they'd collected. When I turned to look, I couldn't move my head. I tried to pull my blanket off to stand up, but I couldn't. The only feeling I could describe was like when your arm or leg falls asleep and you get that pins and needles sensation. But it was all over my body. I was terrified, not knowing why I couldn't move or why the closet was opening. Eventually, I managed to turn my eyes enough to catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. A figure was standing halfway out of the closet, just staring at me. It didn't move. It just stood there watching me struggle. I couldn't do anything but stare back. I'll never forget the figure's long, gangly appearance. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say it looked like the Rake. But obviously, this was a time before internet scary stories and creepypastas, so I didn't know what that was at the time. All I know is I was in a complete state of shock and horror, and I tried to let out a scream to alert my grandparents, but I couldn't even muster up a squeak. Eventually, with enough brute force and a will to live, I managed to regain all my senses and shot up out of my bed and ran to turn on the light. The figure was gone, but the closet was still open. I remember running to my grandparents' room and screaming that there was a man in my closet, and my grandpa, who was a hunter, had many weapons in the house and grabbed one. He threatened anyone who was in the house that they better showed themselves. No one was there. I told them about the closet, but they just told me it must have been open already. I know it wasn't open because that closet already scared me, and I made sure it was closed before I went to bed. I never slept in that room again. I had my brother switch me rooms. I made up an excuse that I didn't like the color of the room, and he just went along with it. But I think he knew I was scared and he was older, so we took the room just to be a good brother. I never told him of the experience I had with the figure because I didn't even know if it was real or not. The second experience was more recent and the only other time that I have had a truly terrifying experience with sleep paralysis. I am now married and I told my wife about my sleep paralysis, but I told her not to worry too much because I am more used to it happening and I usually just keep my eyes shut to avoid seeing anything creepy. And like I said before, it's easily manageable and I usually don't see anything anyway. I just want to be sure. Anyway, this experience happened a few days before writing this. It was during the middle of the day and I was taking a nap in my bed. Usually, when I have sleep paralysis, I can get myself out of it within a few seconds and go back to bed like nothing really happens. Not this time. This time I woke up and knew I was paralyzed, so I tried to move my arms and legs around to get my body awake, but for some reason I could not get myself out of it. Like I said, I keep my eyes closed to avoid seeing anything. But this time, after about 2 or 3 minutes of trying to wake myself up, I started to get frustrated, so I decided to open my eyes. To my left is a large window. I live in an apartment complex in the underground level, so the window leads straight to the ground at eye level. Well, outside in broad daylight, I saw what looked to be the same figure I saw as a child. I can't be too sure though. All I know is that this thing was tall and black and it was walking toward my window. Outside the apartment complex is a line of trees about 40 feet back, and it was at the tree line. As it slowly got closer, I noticed some features on the figure. Its eyes were beet red and it was smiling wide. Its teeth were poking out of its mouth and they were razor sharp. I couldn't do anything but watch in terror as this tall, horrifying figure walked toward me. It put me in a state of fear and I honestly almost started to cry, thinking my life was about to end. Finally, after about 30 seconds of me staring at this figure getting closer to me, I finally managed to wake myself up. And just as soon as it appeared, it was gone. I will never forget the way it was staring at me, menacingly, almost like it was enjoying watching me suffer. Most people find it hard to believe when I tell them, but I have a job where I work from home. In my area, most people work in the automotive industry or in healthcare. There aren't a lot of job options around here. Fortunately, I was able to land a good-paying job that allows me to work from the comfort of my home office. It definitely has its challenges, but it's by far the best opportunity I've found. It's not always perfect. There are definitely downsides. Sometimes, I have to sit at my computer even when there's nothing to do, and it's easy to get distracted. But the biggest issue I face is with the house itself. It's a bit creepy. The house is an old Victorian, like really old, mid-1800s old. A family friend owns it and sold it to me at an incredibly fair price. Basically gave it to me. I was thrilled, because it meant I had a spacious house to live in with my girlfriend. I'm naturally a loner and not really into socializing, so having a large house all to myself with minimal interaction with others and a job I could do from home was pretty much my ideal life. But with the house being so old, it can get pretty spooky, though not because of ghosts or anything. Sometimes I hear the house settling or noises that I just can't explain. I've had a lot of moments where I'm sitting at my desk, working, and suddenly hear a noise that I just can't make sense of. I'll go through the house trying to figure out what it is, but everything seems unchanged. It's as unsettling as it is irritating. So I did what anyone else would do in that situation. I started using background noise to block out the sounds. First, I tried those instrumental tracks on YouTube. The ones that last for hours and are meant to put you at ease. It didn't really work for me. I couldn't get my computer loud enough to drown out all the noises, and it didn't really hold my attention. There was one week where my work was pretty slow, and there wasn't much to do. I still had to sit at my computer, though. The agreement was that I could basically do whatever I wanted as long as I was available if any work came through. I wasn't sure how to fill that time, so I started watching documentaries on YouTube. It was actually pretty fun, and I learned a lot. The next week, when work picked up again, I automatically turned on another documentary. I wasn't able to fully focus on it, but it was much better than just ambient noise. It helped distract me from the sounds of the house. I guess I just didn't have enough mental energy to notice any other noises around me, if that makes sense. After 2 weeks of watching documentaries while I worked, things started to take a strange turn. Everything seemed to be good until one Friday morning. I start work at 8 and this must have happened around 10. I was sitting at my office chair working while I listened to a documentary about a 9/11 conspiracy theory when all of a sudden, I heard an abrupt banging noise coming from upstairs. Like I had said, I hadn't been distracted by any noises for a while by this point. So the fact that I noticed this noise meant that it was probably serious. My fight or flight kicked in. You might laugh at me, but when I work, I keep a knife next to me. I ran upstairs with the knife and looked around for any suspicious noises. The banging had stopped and I didn't know where it had come from. I knew what section of the house that I heard it from, but there didn't seem to be anything out of place. I stood there for a few moments and then I heard it again. It happened right on the other side of my door. I immediately braced myself for there to be some kind of animal or something trying to get in. I didn't really know what to expect. I opened my door to see that the screen door had not been properly closed. My girlfriend didn't close it all the way when she left for work that morning. It was also pretty windy that day, so it was just going back and forth causing a banging noise when the wind got bad. This was kind of a breaking point for me. I didn't want to live my life in constant paranoia and fear of some kind of attacker coming into my home. We live in a safe area. There's never been a serious threat, and I have run around my house with a knife way too many times now. I honestly felt kind of stupid, so I made a decision. I was no longer going to assume that someone was breaking in if and when I ever heard a sound. I put the knife in my dresser in my bedroom and decided that I was just going to be into work while I was working, except for my documentary, of course. So there I was the next week. It happened on a Wednesday. I was sitting in my office doing exactly what I had set out to do. I was working, ignoring the noises, and listening to a documentary. I remember the exact part of the documentary I was on when I heard it. The sound was the loudest sound I had heard in the house up to that point. At first, I reassured myself that it was nothing and that I need to fight against this paranoia. The sound continued and I couldn't take my mind off it. After about 5 minutes of listening to what sounded like rummaging and walking, I went upstairs to check. Bear in mind, I didn't have any weapon on me and I was expecting some kind of reasonable explanation. When I got to my kitchen, I saw that the front door was wide open. The cabinets were all open and there was a strange man rummaging through them. I didn't notice until after the fact, but he had been eating something. I remember screaming at him. I don't remember what I said, but it was something to the effect of, "What are you doing in my house?" Then he just ran off, didn't say a word. He took a loaf of bread with him, but I don't think he took anything else other than what he had eaten before I came upstairs. I reasoned with myself that he must have been a homeless man or something. I don't know why else he would steal a loaf of bread from a very ordinary-looking house. This was the worst thing that could have happened. On some instinctive level, it had proved all my worst fears right. There was some kind of danger in my house. And, of course, it was the one time when I didn't have my knife on me. I lucked out that he didn't try to hurt me or anything, but it was still horrifying to see nonetheless. I just work at a local coffee shop now. It's the only way to stay sane.